Grace Kelly's lady-in-waiting was spying on her, not metaphorically, literally. Madge Tivey-Faucon had been placed in that role by Prince Rainier specifically to report Grace's every movement back to him. Every visitor, every phone call, every hour spent away from the schedule the palace had assigned. Grace called her Tiv. She thought Tiv was her friend. Tiv was reporting to her husband. The hairdresser knew too. Grace sat in the palace salon one afternoon, years into the marriage, and told the woman cutting her hair something she could not say to anyone, with a title, or a position, or a reason to write it down. She said, "I know my husband has affairs with other women. That's very frustrating to me, and makes me very unhappy." The hairdresser said nothing. What could she say? She finished the cut and set, and gathered her things and went home, and she carried the sentence with her for the rest of her life, and she told it eventually to a biographer, because the truth about what happened inside that palace had to leave through the servant's entrance, because the front door was never going to open. This is what you know about Grace Kelly. In 1955, at the Cannes Film Festival, she met a prince. The following year she married him in what Life magazine called the wedding of the century. She had 3 children. In September 1982, she died in a car accident on a road she had driven dozens of times. The world grieved for a fairy tale that had ended. This is what the servants knew, that within months of the wedding, the prince had at least 3 mistresses, that the lady-in-waiting was a spy, that the palace's 200 rooms contained a woman who had given up the most successful acting career of her generation for a life of protocol so rigid that she could not speak freely to any human being who was not paid to listen. That the photographer who came to Monaco in 1962 to film a documentary left with one sentence in her notebook, "I got the distinct feeling that Grace Kelly felt trapped. It wasn't the fairy tale one had expected." That sentence was not published at the time. The palace managed what was published. The palace managed everything except the people who worked there, and the people who worked there remembered what they saw. The woman who said fairy tales tell imaginary stories, and me, I'm a living person, I exist, knew exactly what she was saying. She was not describing a fairy tale. She was distinguishing herself from one. What she was actually living is what this account examines. Not the version that left through the front door, the version the servants carried home. If you're enjoying this so far, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. John Brendan Kelly was the kind of man who produced in the people around him the specific quality of the person who understands that they are in the presence of someone who has decided that the world exists to confirm his assessment of it, and who has organized the world around him with sufficient force and sufficient success that the confirmation is generally available. He had won 3 Olympic gold medals in rowing in 1920 and 1924, had built the Kelly for Brickwork Company into one of the most successful construction enterprises on the East Coast of the United States, had run for mayor of Philadelphia and lost, but had remained sufficiently prominent in the city's political life to be appointed National Director of Physical Fitness by Franklin Roosevelt, and had produced in the brick house he built at 3901 Henry Avenue in the East Falls neighborhood of Philadelphia, a family organized around the athletic and the competitive and the achieving that his own formation had produced in him, and that he expected to be reproduced in the children who grew up inside the house he had built with his own success. The reproduction did not produce Grace. What it produced in the other children was the competitiveness and the athleticism that the house required. Margaret, known as Peggy, the eldest daughter, John, known as Kell, the son who would eventually represent the United States in the same Olympic rowing events that had made his father famous, Lizanne, the youngest. Grace was the third, born on the 12th of November 1929, into a family that had already established its organizing principle, and whose organizing principle was not the principle that Grace's formation was going to produce. She was, by her father's assessment, the least likely to succeed in the family. The assessment was delivered in the terms that Jack Kelly's assessments were delivered in, which were the terms of someone who measured human worth in the specific currencies of the physical and the competitive and the achieving in those specific forms, and Grace's worth in those specific currencies was insufficient in the specific way that the person who has been told since childhood that they are insufficient in the relevant currencies experiences insufficiency. She was not athletic. This was the primary insufficiency in a household organized around the athletic. She was clumsy, by her own account, and the accounts of the people who observed her childhood, in the way that children who are not organized around their physical capacity are clumsy, which was the clumsiness of someone who was not thinking about the body, because the body was not where the attention had decided to live. The attention had decided to live in the arts, in the specific combination of the theatrical and the visual and the musical that her father's household had made available, despite his personal contempt for the arts as a vehicle of serious achievement, because the Kelly family contained alongside Jack's athletic formation the artistic formation of his brothers, specifically George Kelly, the playwright who had won the Pulitzer Prize in 1926 for Craig's Wife, and Walter Kelly, the vaudevillian, who had built a career in popular entertainment. The uncle's formation was the formation that Grace's sensibility responded to, rather than her father's, and the responding was the responding of someone who had found in the uncles the people whose formation matched the formation she was already developing, rather than the formation she was being required to demonstrate. Margaret Major Kelly was the other parent, and her contribution to the formation requires examination, because the formation that Grace carried into Hollywood and Monaco was not only the formation of the insufficient daughter in a competitive household, but the formation of a daughter with a mother whose relationship to her own emotional life and to the emotional lives of her children was organized around the specific quality of the woman who has decided that the management of emotion is the appropriate response to its presence, rather than its expression. Margaret had been a competitive swimmer and the first woman to coach athletic teams at the University of Pennsylvania, and a former model, and she had married the most prominent man available in the Philadelphia of her generation, and had produced the children that the marriage required, and had managed the household that the man's success demanded, and the managing had consumed the energy that the expressing might otherwise have claimed. Grace described her mother in the terms that the biographers who examined the childhood have assembled from Grace's own statements across the years of her adult life, and the terms were the terms of someone who had understood from an early age that the warmth she needed from the parent, who should have been its most natural source, was warmth that the parent had decided to manage rather than provide. Margaret was not cruel. She was cold in the specific way that people who have organized their emotional life around the management of feeling are cold, which is the cold of the absent rather than the cold of the hostile, the cold of the person who is not there in the specific sense that matters, rather than the cold of the person who is there and is making the being there damaging. Grace had absorbed this cold in the way that children absorb the specific quality of the emotional environment they grow up in, which is the way of the formation rather than the event, the slow accumulation of the specific absence across years of its consistent presence. The combination of the insufficient daughter formation from her father and the emotionally managed formation from her mother produced in Grace the specific quality that the biographers and the people who knew her across her adult life consistently identified as the quality that organized her relationships with the men she became attached to, which was the quality of someone who was seeking from the men in her life the specific confirmation that the childhood had consistently declined to provide, and who was seeking it with the urgency of someone for whom the seeking was not the conscious strategy of the adult, but the formation of the child, expressed through the adult's available mechanisms. The available mechanisms in New York City in the late 1940s and early 1950s, for a young woman who was 20 years old and beautiful, in the specific way that Grace Kelly was beautiful, were the mechanisms of the acting world and the social world that the acting world generated, and the mechanisms produced in her the succession of attachments to men who were simultaneously inappropriate and who provided the confirmation that the inappropriate attachment provides before it produces the cost that the inappropriate attachment. She had enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in 1947, at the age of 17, against her father's explicit preference and with the specific determination of someone who had identified in the acting the thing that the Kelly household had not provided, which was the space in which the formation that the household had not valued was the formation that the institution required. The American Academy of Dramatic Arts required from its students the emotional availability and the imaginative responsiveness, and the physical expressiveness that the Kelly household at 3901 Henry Avenue had organized itself around suppressing or redirecting or managing, and the institution's requirement was the specific invitation to the person who had been formed in the specific way that Grace had been formed, to bring what she had been told was insufficient into a context that found it not merely sufficient. She was good at it. The goodness was the goodness that the acting world recognizes in the person who has been formed in a household organized around the suppression of the emotional life and who has developed, from the suppression's long practice, the specific capacity for the controlled expression of the suppressed, which is the capacity that acting most requires. The controlled expression of what has been suppressed for a long time is the specific technical challenge of the actor who is capable of feeling everything and of timing the expression of the feeling with the precision that the scene requires. And Grace had been practicing the controlled expression of the suppressed since early childhood, in the drawing rooms of East Falls and on the sports fields where she was required to perform the athletic interest she did not feel, and the practice had produced in her the specific technical capacity that the American Academy of Dramatic Arts recognized and that Alfred Hitchcock would eventually identify as the quality he had been looking for in the women he was directing. New York in 1947 was New York in the specific quality of the post-war years, the city of the expanding entertainment industry and the expanding media industry, and the specific social world that the expansion generated in the proximity of the people who were building both. Grace moved through this social world with the combination of the Philadelphia formation's social confidence and the acting student's specific attentiveness to the rooms she occupied, and the combination produced the specific effect of someone who was both at ease and acutely present, which was the effect that the people who encountered her in those years consistently noted, and that the men among them consistently found compelling. The compelling was not uncomplicated. The men Grace became attached to in the New York years were the men who provided the specific confirmation that the formation required, and they were the men who were simultaneously unavailable in the specific forms that the formation produced as the acceptable unavailability, which was the unavailability of the older, the married, and the powerful. The director Don Richardson was among the first, and the acting teacher Clark Gable was a later addition. The pattern was the pattern that the formation predicts when the formation has been the formation of insufficient daughter of dominant father, and the attachment style is the style of someone who is seeking the confirmation that the father's authority had declined to extend. She was not naive about this. Grace Kelly was never naive about anything that she had thought carefully about, and she had thought carefully about herself with the specific quality of someone whose intellectual formation, despite the household's organization around the physical, had been thorough and independent, and had produced in her the capacity for self-examination that the acting training had developed further. She knew what she was doing with the men who were unavailable. She did it anyway, because the formation that drives the doing is not neutralized by the awareness of the doing, and the awareness was the awareness that she would spend her adult life maintaining, alongside the formation, rather than using to escape it. The Hollywood years, when they came, were the years in which the formation expressed itself in the context that the formation had produced her for, which was the context of the controlled expression of the suppressed, in the service of the characters that the scripts required her to inhabit. The characters she inhabited for Hitchcock were the characters whose specific quality the formation had equipped her to produce, which were the characters of the composed woman with the passionate interior, the woman whose surface was the ice that the formation had polished, and whose interior was the fire that the formation had been managing. And Hitchcock's camera found the relationship between the ice and the fire, and produced from it the specific quality of the screen presence that made Grace Kelly the actress that the Academy Award for the Country Girl in 1954 recognized, and that the world subsequently understood as the quality that had made her a princess. The quality had not made her a princess. The formation had made her a princess, in the specific sense that the formation had produced the woman whose relationship to the inappropriate and unavailable attachment, combined with the social composure and the physical beauty and the specific quality of the performed availability beneath the composed surface, was the combination that Prince Rainier III of Monaco would encounter at Cannes in 1955, and that the encounter would produce the transaction whose terms this account examines, rather than the love story whose version the world received. The transaction was organized around the specific qualities of both parties, and the specific qualities of both parties were the qualities of two people whose formations had produced them for each other in the specific way that two formations produce people for each other, when the producing is not the producing of the compatible, but the producing of the interlocking, which is the way of two people whose specific needs and specific availabilities align in the specific register of the thing that resembles the thing each person is looking for, rather than the thing itself. Rainier was looking for something. Grace was looking for something. What each was looking for, and what each found instead of it in the other, is the account of the marriage that the servants eventually carried home. The carrying home required first the arriving. The arriving was Cannes in 1955, and what happened at Cannes in 1955 was not the first meeting of the romantic legend, but the first transaction of the institutional account. And the institutional account's first transaction requires the examination of what each party was bringing to it, before the bringing can be understood as the thing it produced. Monaco in 1955 was a principality in the specific condition of the small state that has survived the preceding century through the mechanism of the casino, and that has discovered, in the mid-20th century, that the casino is no longer sufficient. The casino was the Casino de Monte Carlo, the institution that Charles Garnier had designed in 1863 in the same idiom he was simultaneously deploying for the Paris Opera, the idiom of the monumental and the gilded and the specifically European understanding of the spectacular that the Belle Époque had made into the vocabulary of the aspiring. The casino had sustained Monaco through the preceding 9 decades by providing to the wealthy of Europe the specific combination of the gambling and the climate, and the proximity to the French Riviera that the Monaco geography made available, and that the casino's architecture had organized into the specific draw of the place that people with money went to, in the manner of the people who understood that Monaco was the place people with money went to. The circular dependency was the dependency of the brand, and the brand by 1955 was suffering from the specific variety of the brand's decline that occurs when the thing the brand has been selling has been available for long enough that the selling has produced the saturation rather than the appetite. The Riviera had expanded, the options had multiplied. The casino was real, and it was grand, and it was the institution that Garnier had built, but it was competing now with the post-war expansion of the pleasure industry across the Mediterranean coast. And the competition was producing in the casino's revenues the specific trajectory of the brand, whose market has been growing faster than the brand's specific offer, and who has not yet found the new element that the growth requires to be incorporated. Aristotle Onassis had purchased a substantial interest in the Société des Bains de Mer, the company that operated the Casino de Monte Carlo and the principal hotels and businesses of the Principality, in the early 1950s. And the purchase had given the Greek shipping magnate the specific leverage over Monaco's economic life that the purchase of the Principality's primary commercial enterprise generates for the purchaser, when the enterprise is the enterprise that the Principality depends on. Onassis understood leverage. The purchase was the purchase of the person who had identified that the asset's value was the value of what the asset could become, rather than what it currently was. And the becoming required the transformation that Onassis was prepared to fund and direct, and that Rainier was required to accommodate, because the accommodation was the condition of the funding. The accommodation was not comfortable. Rainier III had been the sovereign prince of Monaco since 1949, when he had inherited the position at the age of 26, and the sovereignty of a principality whose primary commercial enterprise was substantially controlled by a man of Onassis's specific character and specific methods, was the sovereignty of someone who understood that the sovereignty required the recovery of the leverage that the Onassis purchase had transferred. The recovery required money, and the money required the specific variety of the attention-generating event that the Monaco brand needed to attract the investment and the tourism and the international prominence that would allow the Principality to expand its economic base beyond the dependency on the casino and the Onassis interests that the dependency had produced. The attention-generating event that Rainier's advisors had identified as the most effective available option was the marriage. The marriage of a ruling prince was always an attention-generating event of the specific kind that Monaco needed, which was the kind that generated coverage across the international press, of a quality and a volume that the principality's size and its commercial offerings could not otherwise attract. But the marriage of a ruling prince to the appropriate European aristocratic candidate, which was the marriage that the dynastic convention of the period required to be the marriage, was the marriage that would generate the appropriate coverage and the appropriate attention in the appropriate register of the European royal family news that the European newspapers covered, and that the specific market the Monaco casino brand addressed would find familiar rather than transformative. What Rainier needed was not the familiar. What Rainier needed was the transformative, and the transformative in 1955 was the American, specifically the Hollywood American, the specific category of the American, whose fame had been produced by the mechanism of the motion picture industry, and whose face was therefore known in every country in which the motion picture industry distributed its product, which by 1955 was every country of any commercial significance in the world. The advisor who made the specific recommendation has been identified in various accounts of the period as Rainier's press attaché, and the recommendation was the recommendation of someone who understood the publicity mechanism well enough to understand that the marriage of a European prince to a Hollywood actress was not the story that the European royal press covered in the register of the dynastic alliance, but the story that every major publication in the world covered in the register of the Fairytale, and the Fairytale was the story that produced the specific quality of the international attention that the Monaco brand required. The Fairytale required the actress required the selection. The selection required the criteria that the selection was organized around, and the criteria were not the criteria of the romantic attachment, because the romantic attachment is organized around the specific person, and the specific person's specific qualities, and the specific feeling that the specific person's specific qualities produce in the person experiencing them, and the selection of the actress was organized around the category rather than the specific person, which was the category of the Hollywood actress, of the appropriate level of fame and the appropriate personal qualities that the Monaco press office could deploy in the management of the Fairytale narrative that the marriage was being designed to produce. The appropriate level of fame required the Academy Award, because the Academy Award was the specific credential that the international press recognized as the credential of the serious actress rather than the actress of the moment, and the serious actress's seriousness was the quality that distinguished the Fairytale from the scandal in the coverage of the marriage of a European prince. The Academy Award for Best Actress in 1954 had been won by Grace Kelly for The Country Girl, and the winning had established her in the specific position of the serious actress of the appropriate level of fame that the selection's criteria required. She was also 25 years old, which was the age of the leading beauty of the Hollywood of the period. She was Catholic, which was the religious requirement of a principality whose sovereign was the head of a Roman Catholic state. She was the daughter of a Philadelphia family of sufficient social standing that the marriage could be presented in the European press as the marriage of an American social equivalent, rather than the marriage of a performer who had risen from the obscurity that the European press would find incompatible with the Fairytale. The introduction was arranged through a French magazine's request for a photographic session with Rainier at the Palace during the 1955 Cannes Film Festival, and the photographic session was arranged in the specific way that such sessions are arranged when the person arranging them is the person who wants the session to produce a specific outcome, which is the arrangement that ensures that the two people being photographed together are the two people whose interaction the arranger wants to occur in the context that the photographs will document. Grace's attendance was not the spontaneous acceptance of a journalist's invitation. It was the managed beginning of a sequence whose management was the management of the people who understood what the sequence was for. She arrived at the palace with her hair still damp and a wrinkled gown, and the flowers that she had arranged in her hair to compensate for the absence of the blow-dry that the Cannes electricity strike had made unavailable. The improvisation with the flowers has become one of the romantic legend's most frequently repeated details, because the legend requires the meeting to contain the specific quality of the imperfect and the unmanaged, that distinguishes the genuine romantic encounter from the staged one, and the flowers in the damp hair are the detail that the legend deploys to establish the genuineness. The genuineness is not in question as a quality of Grace's specific experience of the meeting. Rainier was charming, as Grace told people afterward. He showed her the gardens and the private zoo and the palace's principal rooms, and conducted the tour with the specific ease of someone who had been the sovereign of a small principality since the age of 26, and who was therefore very good at receiving visitors in the context of his sovereign environment. The meeting was a meeting between two people who found each other interesting. It was also a meeting between two people who were being observed by the people who had arranged for them to be in the same room, for reasons that the observation's specificity confirmed were the reasons of the institutional interest rather than the personal. The photographic session's results were assessed afterward by the people who had organized the session in the terms that the institutional interest required. And the assessment was the assessment of someone who had looked at the photographs and concluded that the woman in the photographs was the woman the criteria required. The subsequent correspondence, the letters that Grace and Rainier exchanged across the months between the May meeting and the Christmas visit when he came to Philadelphia, was the correspondence of two people developing a personal connection, and was also the correspondence of a process that the institutional management on both sides was monitoring and managing toward the outcome that the institutional management had designed the process to produce. The Christmas visit was the visit that produced the proposal, and the proposal's timing, 3 days after Rainier's arrival in Philadelphia, was the timing of a man who had been conducting a correspondence for 6 months with the specific purpose of the proposal, and who had decided that 3 days of the Philadelphia visit was the period of personal interaction that the proposal required before the proposal could be made in the form that the personal interaction would allow to be received as the genuine expression of the personal feeling rather than the conclusion of the institutional sequence. He proposed after 3 days. She accepted. Jack Kelly's response to the terms of the engagement included the response to the financial terms, which were the terms that Grace and her family were told after the engagement's announcement, which was that Monaco required a dowry of $2 million. The requirement was the requirement of a state that the biographers examining Monaco's financial situation in 1955 described as nearly bankrupt, and the $2 million was the investment in the principality's commercial recovery that the dowry was representing, rather than merely the dynastic convention that the dowry's form was deploying. Jack Kelly's initial response was the response that the man who had built his own fortune from the brick trade made when told that his daughter's value was to be assessed in a specific financial sum. His daughter, he said, did not have to pay any man to marry her. He was right that she did not have to. She did anyway. The $2 million was paid. Grace paid half of it herself, from the earnings of the Hollywood career she was about to surrender. The surrendering of the career was the element of the transaction that the romantic legends accounting had always found most comfortable to present as the voluntary sacrifice of the person who has found something more important than the thing she is giving up, which is the presentation that the fairy tale requires, because the fairy tale's logic is the logic of the thing given up for the thing received, and the received must be greater than the given for the fairy tale to function as the fairy tale. What the career represented, assessed honestly rather than in the fairy tale's register, was the most successful acting career that Hollywood had produced in the generation of Grace Kelly's peers, organized around the collaboration with one of the cinema's greatest directors, and two more major films already in development, and the specific position of the Academy Award winner at 24 years old, who had the entirety of the career's most productive decades ahead of her. She gave it up for a $2 million dowry she paid half of herself, a palace whose lady-in-waiting was a spy appointed by her husband, and a marriage that produced 3 mistresses within months of the ceremony. The fairy tale's accounting of this transaction was the accounting of the thing received rather than the thing surrendered. The honest accounting requires both. What the palace looked like from the inside, for the person who had made this accounting-specific transaction, is where the servant's knowledge begins. The wedding produced more coverage than any event in the history of the principality, and most events in the history of the post-war world. and the production was not the incidental byproduct of two people's decision to marry, but the designed outcome of the institutional machinery that had been constructing the event's coverage apparatus since the announcement of the engagement in January 1956. MGM had purchased the rights to film the ceremony for $1 million, which was the specific commercial valuation that the motion picture studio had placed on the documentary footage of its recently contracted actress marrying a European prince, and the valuation established at the outset the specific register in which the event was operating, which was the register of the commercial production rather than the personal occasion. The studio's camera crews were present, alongside the documentary film units and the television broadcasting equipment of the 9 countries that were carrying the ceremony live, and the 30 million people who watched it across those 9 countries were watching the product that the machinery had been building toward since Rainier's 3-day Philadelphia proposal had produced the raw material. Grace's bridal trousseau alone had required 6 weeks of work by 35 seamstresses at MGM's costume department. The wedding gown had been designed by Helen Rose, MGM's chief costume designer, who had also designed the dress Grace wore in High Society, the final film she had completed before the Monaco move, and the design was the design of someone who understood that the gown was required to function simultaneously as the wedding dress of a princess and as the costume of the studio's most prominent current asset, the two functions being compatible in the specific context of the event's commercial apparatus, and the compatibility being the compatibility of the institutional interests that had organized the event around the production of the image that both institutions, the studio and the principality, required. The image was spectacular. The gown was ivory silk taffeta and antique rose point lace, and required 100 yards of silk net alone, and the veil was 120 yards of silk illusion, and the specifications of the fabric quantities have been reproduced in every subsequent account of the wedding, because the quantities are the specific vocabulary of the spectacular that the fashion and wedding coverage deploys when the spectacular is the thing being described. They were real quantities. The gown was genuinely beautiful. The photographs were genuinely remarkable. The 30 million viewers who watched across 9 countries were watching something that the image genuinely warranted watching. What the image did not show, and what the machinery of the commercial apparatus had not been designed to show, because the machinery was the machinery of the image's production rather than the image's examination, was what the ceremony's participants knew that the ceremony's viewers did not. The guests who had come from the relevant corners of the European aristocracy and the American entertainment industry and the Monaco Principality's social world knew, in the specific way that the people at a wedding know what the people who have organized the wedding's public presentation have decided the coverage should not contain, the specific dimensions of the transaction that the ceremony was formalizing. They knew the dowry. They knew Monaco's finances. They knew that the advisor had recommended the Hollywood actress strategy and that the Hollywood actress had been identified through a managed process rather than a romantic encounter. They knew, because the world of European royalty and its adjacent social networks is a world of very complete and very private knowledge, that the fairy tale was the public version of an arrangement whose private version was the version this account has been assembling. Grace knew the dimensions of what she had signed. The contract she had been required to sign before the marriage formalized the terms of the transaction in the specific language of the legal document, rather than the language of the romantic legend. She was required to renounce her acting career in Monaco. The principality's sovereign could not be married to a working actress, and the renunciation was the condition of the marriage, rather than the voluntary decision of someone who had decided that love was more important than career. She was required to produce heirs, which was the dynastic condition of the marriage of a sovereign prince, and was stated in the contract with the directness of the legal document's statement of the condition, rather than the circumlocution of the personal conversation. She had also been told, at some point in the preceding months, that her films were to be banned in Monaco. The banning of her films in Monaco was the specific institutional action of a sovereign who had decided that the commercial availability of his wife's previous professional life in the territory he governed was incompatible with the image of the wife's new position, and the banning was the action that most precisely established before the ceremony had occurred, the specific quality of the situation Grace was entering. She had made 11 films. The films existed. The films were good, including 2 that Hitchcock had directed, and 1 that had won her the Academy Award. The films were being watched in cinemas across the world, which was the world that the international distribution of the motion picture industry made its product available to. In Monaco, the films were banned. The woman who had made them would be living in Monaco. The films she had been would not be permitted to exist in the place where she would be existing. The civil ceremony was on the 18th of April 1956, in the throne room of the palace, conducted by the mayor of Monaco, in the presence of the family and the close guests. The religious ceremony was on the 19th of April, in the Cathedral of St. Nicholas, in front of the full assembly of the 600 guests and the camera crews and the broadcasting equipment and the 30 million viewers across 9 countries. Grace wore the gown. Rainier wore his dress uniform. The Archbishop of Monaco officiated. The ceremony lasted approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes, and the coverage produced the imagery that the machinery had been designed to produce, which was the imagery of the fairy tale's most legible moment, the moment when the woman in the beautiful dress becomes the princess in the manner that the fairy tale has always required the princess to become, through the ceremony and the vows and the authority of the man with the official capacity to confer the title. The honeymoon was a 7-week cruise on the prince's yacht, the Deo Juvante II, through the Mediterranean. The yacht departed Monaco on the 20th of April, the day after the religious ceremony, and in the hours following the departure, the specific quality of the situation that the preceding months of the engagement and the ceremony and the machinery had been managing became available for the first time without the management. The press boats that had been following the yacht through the Monaco harbour and along the first stretch of the Mediterranean coast eventually turned back when the yacht had proceeded far enough from the principality to make the following impractical, and the turning back of the press boats produced the specific condition of the yacht's continuation without the press, which was the condition that the preceding months had not yet provided, and that the honeymoon was now providing, in the form of 2 people alone on a boat in the Mediterranean, without the machinery. The alone on the boat was the first extended period of the marriage's actual content rather than its public production, and the accounts of the honeymoon that the biographers have assembled from the available sources describe the period in terms that the romantic legend requires to be understood as the adjustment period of 2 people discovering each other in the specific context of the sustained proximity that marriage provides. And the adjustment is the normal adjustment of 2 people who have not previously lived together in the sustained proximity of the marriage, discovering the specific daily reality of the person they have married. The specific daily reality of the person Grace had married was the daily reality of a man who was the sovereign of a principality and who had been the sovereign since the age of 26, and who had organized his daily life around the requirements of that sovereignty in the ways that the sovereignty required, which were the ways of the person whose schedule and whose priorities and whose social world were organized around the institutional requirements of the position rather than around the preferences of the person occupying it. She was not at the center of his schedule. She was not at the center of his priorities. She was at the center of the fairy tale's image, which was the thing the machinery had been producing, and the machinery had produced it with the efficiency of the well-organized institutional apparatus. But the yacht in the Mediterranean without the machinery was not the image. It was the marriage, and the marriage was the marriage of 2 people who barely knew each other, who had conducted their courtship through letters across the Atlantic in the months between the May meeting and the Christmas proposal, and who were now discovering in the sustained proximity of the honeymoon the specific quality of what the letters had been describing to each other across the months of their production. The letters had been describing 2 people who were presenting themselves to each other in the specific register of the letter, which is the register of the person who has had the time to compose the presentation and who is presenting the version of themselves that the composed time permits, rather than the version that the unmanaged daily reality produces. The daily reality of the honeymoon was the unmanaged version, and the unmanaged version was the version that the biographers who examined the honeymoon's accounts have described in terms that the fair examination of those accounts produces. which was not the version of two people discovering in the sustained proximity the depth of the feeling that the letters had suggested, but the version of two people discovering in the sustained proximity the specific ways in which the letters had been managing the presentation of the person in ways that the person's daily reality did not sustain. Caroline Louise Marguerite Grimaldi was born on the 23rd of January 1957. The date of her birth, placed beside the date of the religious ceremony on the 19th of April 1956, produces the arithmetic that the coverage of the time noted with the specific vocabulary that the coverage of the time applied to the arithmetic of the royal first child's birth in close proximity to the wedding date, which was the vocabulary of the 9 months and the 5 days. Caroline was born 9 months and 5 days after the religious ceremony. The arithmetic was the arithmetic that required no further annotation in the context it was produced in, and the coverage did not provide the further annotation, but noted the arithmetic and allowed it to produce the understanding it produced. The understanding was the understanding that the requirement to produce heirs had been the requirement that the contract had specified, and that the honeymoon had been the instrument of the requirement's initiation, and the initiation had produced the result within the minimum available interval. Grace was 26 years old. She had been married for 9 months and 5 days. She was a mother. She was a princess. She was the person who had signed the contract and paid half the dowry and surrendered the career and accepted the ban on her films and moved from Philadelphia and New York to a 200-room palace in a principality of 400 acres and 20,000 people. And she had been in the palace for 9 months and 5 days, and she was a mother. The palace was the specific environment that the 9 months and 5 days had been conducting the adjustment in, and the adjustment's specific character was the character of the environment rather than simply of the marriage, because the environment was the environment of the 200-room palace with the dozens of servants and the lady-in-waiting who was reporting her movements to her husband, and the protocols whose management organized the daily life of the princess in the form that the principality's understanding of what the princess's daily life should be had established, and that Grace was now inhabiting rather than the life she had been living in New York and Philadelphia and Hollywood. The specific quality of the environment is what the next part of this account examines, because the environment was the environment that the servants who worked in it experienced alongside Grace, and that the truth the servants carried home was the truth of the environment as well as the truth of the marriage. And the two truths were the truths of the same place, and the place was the palace, and the palace is where this account's examination of what the servants knew needs to spend the most time, because the palace was the specific geography of the private life that the public image of the fairy tale had been designed to cover. The palace had 200 rooms. The number appears in every account of Grace Kelly's Monaco years, in the form of the detail that is supposed to establish the magnificence of what she had received, and the establishing does its work in the register of the magnitude. 200 rooms, which is more rooms than any person requires for the living of any life, which is the point, which is that the 200 rooms are not the rooms in which a life is lived, but the rooms in which a position is maintained, and the maintaining of a position and the living of a life are different activities that require different things from the environment in which they are conducted. The palace of the Prince of Monaco occupied its specific hilltop above the old town of Monacoville, overlooking the harbour and the casino and the sea, and had been built and rebuilt and extended across the 7 centuries of the Grimaldi family's governance of the principality, in the manner that a ruling dynasty's primary residence is built and rebuilt across 7 centuries, which is the manner of the accretion of the necessary and the ceremonial and the historically significant until the accumulation has produced the building that no single architectural vision would have produced, and that represents instead the layered record of 7 centuries of the specific requirements of the specific dynasty that had been occupying and extending and modifying it across those centuries. The result was magnificent in the way that the accretion of 7 centuries of the magnificent always is, and it was also the result of 7 centuries of the requirements of the position rather than the requirements of the person, and the distinction was the distinction that Grace Kelly was now required to inhabit. Dozens of servants staffed the palace. The staffing was the staffing of an institution rather than a household, organized around the specific functions that the maintenance of a ruling prince's primary residence requires, when the primary residence is also the seat of the principality's governmental operations and the ceremonial venue for the official occasions of the sovereign's year. The chef and the kitchen staff manage the food, the household staff manage the cleaning and the maintenance of the 200 rooms. The secretarial staff manage the correspondence and the scheduling and the specific administrative functions of the princess's public calendar. The security staff manage the access and the perimeter. The ladies-in-waiting managed the princess. The lady-in-waiting was the specific category of the palace staff, whose function was the function most intimate with the person of the princess, and most different from the function the title implied. The title implied the attendance, the specific proximity of the person whose role was to be present in the service of the royal person's requirements, to carry the things that the royal person should not be seen carrying, and to manage the small transactions of the royal person's public appearances that the dignity of the position required to be managed by someone other than the position's holder. The actual function, in the specific case of Madge Tivey-Faucon, was the function that her appointment's circumstances had established and that the accounts of the period have documented with sufficient consistency to constitute the corroborated picture of the lady-in-waiting who was something else. Madge Tivey-Faucon was Australian, a fact that the various accounts of her tenure note in the specific way that the biographical detail is noted when it is relevant to the understanding of the person's position, which was the way of establishing that she was not the French or Monegasque woman that the palace's social world would naturally have produced for the role, and that her appointment therefore reflected the specific criteria of the person who had appointed her, rather than the natural circulation of the principality's social world. Rainier had appointed her. The appointment was his, not the result of the recommendation of the palace's household management or the social world's natural provision of the appropriate candidate, but the specific choice of the sovereign, who had decided that the appropriate candidate for the role of his wife's most intimate daily attendant was the person he had chosen for the reasons he had chosen her. The reasons, documented in the accounts that the biographers assembled from the people who were in the palace in those years, included the reason that was the appointment's primary organizational purpose, which was the purpose of the reporting. Madge Tivey-Faucon reported Grace's movements to Rainier. The report was the daily account of where Grace had gone, and whom she had seen, and what she had said, and what the saying had produced in the people who had heard it, and the reporting was the specific function that the appointment had been organized around producing, conducted through the specific mechanism of the intimate daily attendance that the lady-in-waiting's role provided to the person conducting the reporting. To report on someone's movements, you need access to the person's daily life at the level of proximity that the lady-in-waiting's role provides, which is the level of the room and the conversation and the visitor and the hour, and Madge had that level. Grace called her Tiv. The diminutive was the diminutive of a person who had decided that the woman attending her daily was the person whose presence in the daily life warranted the specific intimacy of the shortened name, and the deciding was the deciding of someone who had not yet understood that the intimacy of the shortened name was the intimacy that the person receiving the name was reporting to the person who had appointed her. The understanding arrived eventually. The accounts of the people who were in the palace in those years describe the period in which the understanding arrived as the period in which Grace's relationship to Madge shifted in the specific way that the relationship shifts when the person whose trust has been misplaced discovers the misplacing, and the discovery produced the ending of the relationship and the eventual dismissal of Madge from the palace, in the circumstances that the accounts of the period describe as the circumstances of Rainier's decision rather than Grace's, which was the decision of the person who had made the appointment and who concluded, eventually, that the appointment's function had been completed by its years of operation and that the continuation of the function was no longer the institutional requirement it had been in the early years of the marriage. Madge was dismissed in February 1962, after approximately 6 years in the role. The dismissal was the dismissal that Rainier directed, and the dismissed woman left Monaco and was replaced by a series of subsequent attendants whose appointments did not carry the documented reporting function that Madge's had, and the replacement was the replacement that the palace's management of the period produced in the form of the normalized household staffing, rather than the specific institutional function that the early years had required. The protocols were the dimension of the palace environment that Grace had been required to learn, and that the learning of had organized the first years of the marriage in the specific form of the person who is doing two things simultaneously, which were the things of learning the role and performing the role before the learning was complete, and the performance of the role before the learning's completion was the performance that the role's observers in Monaco had been assessing with the specific attention of people who had not chosen the person being assessed, and who were therefore more interested in the finding of the inadequacy than the acknowledgement of the achievement. The Monegasques had not chosen Grace. The sovereign had chosen her, and the principality's subjects had received the choice with the combination of the fairy tale's excitement at the wedding and the subsequent assessment of the daily reality of the woman who had arrived from Philadelphia to occupy the position that the principality's understanding of what the princess's position required had established before Grace had arrived to occupy it. The assessment had found, in the early years, the specific variety of insufficiency that the subjects of a small principality find in the American who has arrived to become their sovereign's consort, and who does not yet speak the French that the official functions require, and who brings to the performance of the protocol the combination of the American informality and the Hollywood training that neither the principality's history nor the European royal tradition had prepared as the appropriate formation for the Princess of Monaco. She did not speak French adequately in the early years. The inadequacy was the inadequacy of someone who had been formed in the English-speaking world and who was now required to conduct the official functions of the position in the language that the official functions operated in. And the conducting of the official functions in a language in which the conducting was inadequate produced in Grace the specific management strategy of the person who has decided that the inadequacy is less damaging than the attempt, which was the strategy of the silence. She remained silent at the official dinners in the early years rather than speak the French that would embarrass her or misrepresent her husband's position, and the silence was interpreted by the people at the official dinners as the silence of the personality that the silence produced in the observer rather than the silence of the strategy that the silence was, which was the personality of the cold and the remote, and the insufficiently warm for the position that the Monegasques had decided the position required. The insufficiency narrative was the narrative that the Monegasques had been developing since the wedding, and that the early years' specific difficulties had provided with the material the narrative required. She was too American. She was insufficiently formal. She was too direct in the expression of opinion that the European court culture required to be managed rather than expressed. She was not sufficiently Monegasque, which was the insufficiency that the subjects of a small principality directed at the person who had arrived from outside the principality to occupy its primary position, and who had not yet demonstrated the specific accommodation to the principality's culture that the accommodation's time required. The time requirement was the time requirement that no one had adequately explained to Grace before her arrival, because the time requirement is the thing that institutions with long histories produce from the inside and that the person arriving from the outside cannot fully understand until the inside has provided the experience of it. The inside had provided the experience of it in the form of the first years, and the first years had produced the specific assessment of the Monegasques and the specific silence at the dinners, and the specific reporting by Madge, and the specific protocols that Grace was learning in the form of the performance before the learning, and the combination had produced in Grace the specific condition that the photographer Eve Arnold, arriving in Monaco in 1962 to work on a CBS documentary, captured in the sentence that she put in her notebook after the weeks of observation. Eve Arnold had been photographing the world's prominent women for decades, with the specific eye of the photographer who is interested in what the prominent woman's constructed public image is managing, rather than what the image is showing, and the eye had been trained by the specific practice of the documentary photographer who understands that the image tells its own story when the photographer is paying attention to what the image is telling, rather than to what the subject wants the image to say. She spent weeks in Monaco. She photographed Grace in the official contexts and the unofficial ones, and she observed the palace environment and the marriage's daily texture and the specific quality of the life that the princess's public image was required to present, and that the photographer's presence in the unofficial contexts was allowing the photographer to compare to the public image. At the end of the weeks, Eve Arnold put the sentence in her notebook. It was the sentence that Joan Dale, Grace's American friend who had been asked to serve as a lady-in-waiting before the Monegasque hostility had made the appointment of an American impossible, had separately recorded in her own memoir of the years she spent in Monaco, in the specific vocabulary of a different metaphor for the same observation. Arnold's sentence was, "I got the distinct feeling that Grace Kelly felt trapped. It wasn't the fairy tale one had expected." Dale's sentence was, "I am sure there were times in the early years when she felt somewhat like a prisoner in a gilded cage behind the palace walls." Two people. Two different observations from two different positions in Grace's social world. One the professional photographer working on a documentary, and one the personal friend who had been invited to join the household. The same sentence, in different words, about the same thing. The thing was not the fairy tale. The thing was the cage, and the gilding was the 200 rooms, and the dozens of servants, and the Cartier engagement ring, and the MGM gown, and the 30 million viewers across 9 countries. And the gilding was real, and the cage was also real, and the servants who lived inside both understood which was which. The hairdresser was one of them. She was the person whose access to the princess's private register was the access of the service provider whose professional function required the sustained proximity without the institutional distance that the other service providers maintained. And Grace had told her the thing that the institutional distance required to be told in the register of the person whose professional function made the distance temporarily unavailable. The hairdresser had listened. The hairdresser had remembered. What Grace had told her, and what the hairdresser eventually told, is what the next part examines in the terms that the telling required. The hairdresser's name has not been preserved in the biographical record, in the form that the biographical record preserves the names of the people whose proximity to the famous produces the account that the biographers draw on, which is the form of the named source whose identity the publication of the account requires to establish. What has been preserved is the account itself, in the form that the biographer Wendy Lee assembled for True Grace, The Life and Times of an American Princess, published in 2007, which drew on the accounts of the people who were in the palace in those years, and who had carried what they had seen and heard in the specific form of the memory that the seen and the heard produce in people who understand that what they have witnessed is significant, and who hold it in the private register until the private register's management produces the release that the biographical account receives. The hairdresser had been in the salon with Grace. The salon was the specific room of the palace where the intimate service of the professional, whose function required the sustained physical proximity without the ceremonial distance, was conducted, and the sustained physical proximity without the ceremonial distance was the condition in which the private register occasionally became available, rather than the managed version that the ceremonial distance maintained. Grace sat in the chair. The hairdresser attended to her hair with the professional attention of the person whose function required the attention, and who was therefore in the room in the specific role of the person whose presence is required, and whose function is the condition of the presence, which is the specific role that produces, in the person being attended, to the occasional lapse of the managed version into the private one. The lapse produced the sentence. Grace said, "I know my husband has affairs with other women. That's very frustrating to me and makes me very unhappy." The sentence was the sentence of someone who had decided, in that specific room, with that specific person, that the management of the private register was less important than the expression of the thing that the management had been managing. And the deciding was the deciding of someone for whom the sustained management of the thing had reached the point at which the expression was the alternative to the breakdown of the management entirely, which was the alternative that the principality and the marriage and the position required to be prevented. The expression in the hairdresser's salon was the controlled release of the controlled expression of the suppressed, which was the specific capacity that the acting training and the Kelly household formation had developed in Grace across the preceding decades, directed now not at the camera but at the person in the room whose professional function made her the safest available recipient of the controlled release. The hairdresser listened. She finished the hair. She said nothing that the biographical record has preserved in the form of a response, because the response of the person receiving the confidence of the prominent, in the professional context of the intimate service, is the response of the person who understands that the receiving of the confidence is the function, and that the producing of the response is not the function, and the function was the function she had been employed to perform. She went home. She carried the sentence. She eventually told it to the person who eventually told it to Wendy Lee, and Wendy Lee published it, and the publication produced the specific addition to the public record of Grace Kelly's Monaco years that the publication of sentences like that one produces, which was the addition of the private register to the public record in the specific form of the thing that the management had been managing, and that the management's management had eventually been insufficient to contain. The management had been managing the affairs since within months of the wedding. Wendy Lee's research, drawing on sources whose proximity to the palace in the first years of the marriage produced the accounts that the research assembled, established that Prince Rainier III had been involved with at least 3 other women within months of the April 1956 ceremony that 30 million people had watched as the wedding of the century. The at least 3 was the number that the research produced from the sources available to it, and the number was the number of the documented involvements, rather than the number of the actual involvements, which the research acknowledged could not be established with the precision that the documented number permitted, because the undocumented involvements were the ones whose documentation the palace's management of the information about its sovereign's personal life had been most thorough in preventing. What Grace knew about the affairs, assembled from the accounts of the people who were in the palace, and who observed the princess's engagement with the information as it became available to her, was knowledge that arrived in the specific way that the knowledge of a spouse's infidelity arrives in the marriage of the person who is simultaneously the subject of the institutional surveillance that the lady-in-waiting's reporting function provided. The surveillance was the surveillance that produced the information about Grace's movements for Rainier, and the same palace environment that produced that information flow also produced the information flow in the other direction, which was the information about Rainier's conduct that the palace staff's knowledge of the sovereign's daily life generated, and that reached Grace through the channels that the staff's knowledge made available. The channels were the channels of the palace's internal social world, which was the social world of the staff rather than the social world of the principality's official occasions, and the staff's social world was the social world in which the knowledge of what was happening in the palace's various rooms and at various hours was the knowledge that the staff's professional proximity to those rooms and those hours produced as the natural byproduct of the function. The chef knew what the kitchen's timing told him about who was dining and when. The household staff knew what the room's condition told them about who had occupied it and in what circumstances. The security staff knew what the access logs told them about who had entered and departed and at what times. The lady-in-waiting knew what the princess's schedule told her about the discrepancies between the princess's knowledge of the prince's schedule and the prince's actual schedule's content. Madge Tivey-Faucon was in the specific position of the person who held the most intimate knowledge of both sides of the information that was available in the palace's social world, because her function was the function of reporting Grace's movements to Rainier, and her proximity was the proximity of the person who was therefore aware of the information about Rainier's conduct that was available in the palace's social world, and that was also the information whose existence was the information Grace was managing around. The specific quality of the situation that Madge's position produced was the quality of the person who is simultaneously the spy and the witness to what the spied upon is managing. And the managing of the spy and the witness in the same person was the situation that Grace's hairdresser confession was one expression of, and that the accounts of Grace's other communications about the affairs were further expressions of. Grace told Madge about the affairs. The accounts of this communication have been preserved in the biographical record in the form of the account of the person who was told, and the form established the specific quality of the conversation in the terms that the conversation required to be understood in the context of the relationship's actual structure, which was the structure of the spy receiving the information from the person being spied upon about the person who had organized the spying. Grace said to Madge that she was extremely unhappy about Rainier's relationships with other women, and that she found the situation humiliating, and that she needed the situation to be different from what it was. Madge received the communication in the professional register of the lady-in-waiting, which was the register of the person whose function was the attendance and not the response, and Madge had the response that the function required, which was the attendance's management rather than the engagement with the content. What Madge did with the content was the question that the account's structure required to be addressed, and that the answer to produces the specific quality of the situation's most uncomfortable dimension, which was the dimension of the person who has been told by the princess that she is unhappy about the prince's affairs, and who is simultaneously the person reporting the princess's movements to the prince. The reporting of the princess's movements included the reporting of what the princess was communicating about her unhappiness, and the reporting of what the princess was communicating about her unhappiness was the reporting that the reporting function required to be reported, and the requirement was the requirement of the function rather than the requirement of the specific content, which meant that the specific content of the unhappiness about the affairs was the content that the reporting function was organized around reporting, regardless of whether the content was the content that the reporting was designed to produce. Wendy Lee described Grace as being surrounded by decadence and Rainier's disreputable friends, and as having been humiliated by the affair's early arrival in the marriage. The humiliation was the specific humiliation of the person whose marriage's public image was the image of the fairy tale and whose marriage's private reality was the reality of the affairs within months of the ceremony that 30 million people had watched. And the specific quality of the humiliation in that specific context was the quality of the humiliation of the gap between the image and the reality, which is the most complete available form of the humiliation, because it is the form in which the public image of the thing is the thing that makes the private reality of the thing most unbearable. She eventually had affairs of her own. The biographical accounts of Grace Kelly's extramarital relationships in the Monaco years have been the accounts whose treatment in the public record has varied between the biographies that regarded the documentation of the affairs as the documentation of a private person's private life, whose privacy the documentation violated, and the biographies that regarded the documentation as the documentation of the response to the situation that the marriage had produced, and the variation reflects the different assessments of the purpose of the biographical documentation rather than the different assessments of the factual accuracy of the documentation. What the available sources established, in the accounts that the biographies drew on from the people who were in Monaco in those years, was the pattern of a woman who had responded to the specific situation of the marriage's first months with the same mechanism that Rainier had deployed, and who had deployed it with the specific quality of the discretion that the formation and the management had developed in her across the preceding years. The discretion was the discretion of the person who understood that the deployment of the mechanism required the management of the mechanism's visibility in the way that the person whose marriage's public image was the fairy tale required the management of anything that the fairy tale's image could not contain. What the fairy tale's image could not contain was the palace salon and the hairdresser and the sentence and the specific content of the sentence, and the palace's management of the information about the princess's private life had been the management that had kept the sentence in the private register until the register's eventual release into the biographical account that eventually produced it in the public form that the publication required. What the publication produced was the addition of the sentence to the public record in the form of the specific truth that the servants had carried home, and the carrying home was the carrying home of the specific quality of the knowledge that the intimate service provides to the person whose function places them in the room where the managed version occasionally becomes unavailable, and where the private register of the person being managed produces the sentence that the management's function was organized around preventing from being produced. The hairdresser had been in the room when the prevention failed. She had heard the sentence. She had carried it home. She had eventually told it to the person who eventually told it to Wendy Lee. The sentence was, "I know my husband has affairs with other women. That's very frustrating to me and makes me very unhappy." The sentence was the truth that the servants knew and the public did not, expressed in the register of the person who was simultaneously the princess and the woman, and who had found, in the room with the hairdresser, the brief condition in which the two were the same, rather than the managed versions of each, that the palace's environment required. The environment required the management required the performance required the room with the hairdresser to be the room where the management occasionally became unavailable. It did not require the hairdresser to carry the sentence home. The hairdresser carried it anyway. In December 1961, Alfred Hitchcock arrived at the Palace of Monaco by silver Rolls-Royce and asked Grace Kelly to come back to the cinema. He had a script. He had a budget. He had a leading man named Sean Connery, who had just completed a film called Dr. No that the studio's marketing department was preparing to release as something significant, and that the people who had seen the early footage had already concluded was going to make the man who had made it famous, in the specific way that a single film sometimes makes a person famous when the film and the person are the correct combination of the thing the moment requires. Hitchcock had the script and the budget and Sean Connery, and he had the specific reason for wanting Grace rather than anyone else, which was the reason of a director who had worked with her 3 times and who had found in her the specific instrument for the specific quality of his cinema that no other available actress provided in the form she provided it. The film was Marnie. The script was the script of a woman with a compulsive stealing disorder and a dark psychological history whose unraveling the film's narrative was organized around, and the character was the character that the specific combination of the controlled surface and the disturbed interior that Grace Kelly's screen presence had always represented, required to inhabit, in the form that Hitchcock's direction of that combination had always produced its most precise results. He had made 3 films with her. Dial M for Murder had established the quality. Rear Window had deepened it. To Catch a Thief had deployed it in the sunlight of the Riviera, with the specific ease of the quality at rest, rather than under pressure. Marnie was the quality under maximum pressure, which was the direction in which Hitchcock had always been moving the quality across the 3 preceding films, and which required the specific person whose formation had produced the quality to be the person who inhabited the character. Grace had not acted since High Society in 1956, which was the film she had completed before the wedding, and which had been released while she was already in Monaco, and which had been the last film in which the world had seen Grace Kelly the actress, rather than the cover image of the Fairytale. She had been in Monaco for 6 years when Hitchcock arrived with the Rolls-Royce and the script, and the 6 years had been the 6 years of the protocol, and the affairs, and the hairdresser's salon, and Madge's reporting, and Caroline's birth, and Albert's birth, in 1958, and the miscarriages that the accounts of the period document as the losses that accumulated alongside the children who arrived, and that organized around the children a dimension of the marriage's domestic life that was genuine, and that Grace held with the specific quality of something that the palace had given her, that she had not expected to value as much as she valued it. But she had also been, across those 6 years, the person who sat in the palace salon and confessed to the hairdresser, and who had found in the Monegasque's hostility, and the protocol's management, and the affair's humiliation, and the daily reality of the gilded cage, the specific conditions of the person for whom the thing that had made her who she was had been removed from the daily life and replaced with the management of the thing's absence. The thing that had made her who she was the acting, and the acting was not available in Monaco because she had signed the contract that had required its renunciation as the condition of the marriage's permission, and the renunciation had been the renunciation of the specific activity through which the formation that the Kelly household had produced, and the ardor had developed, and the Hitchcock collaboration had realized, had been expressed in the form that the expression required, which was the form of the inhabited character in the service of the director's vision. The palace announced that Grace would return to acting. The announcement was made in the spring of 1962, and it was the announcement whose specific timing and specific form established the specific quality of the process that had produced it, which was not the process of a woman deciding to return to acting and informing the palace of her decision, but the process of the palace's communications apparatus managing the announcement of a decision whose making had involved the sovereign's involvement in the way that the sovereign's involvement in the decisions of his household is always involved when the household is the household of a prince, and the decision is a decision about the behavior of the princess. The announcement produced in Monaco, the reaction that the announcement produced in a small principality whose population of 20,000 people had formed, across the 6 years of the Fairytale's daily management, a specific understanding of what their princess was, and what she did, and what the presence of the movie cameras in the principality would mean for the principality's relationship to the image that the princess's presence had been generating, and that the principality's tourism and commercial position had been benefiting from. What the movie cameras would mean was the conversion of the princess from the image of the principality's fairy tale back into the actress whose professional function was the image of something else, and the conversion was the conversion that the 20,000 people of Monaco received as the thing that the princess was not supposed to be doing, because the princess had been theirs, rather than Hollywood's, for 6 years, and the returning to Hollywood was the returning from theirs. The furor was immediate, and it was loud, and it was the specific variety of the public expression of displeasure that a small principality produces when the population, whose collective judgment of the princess had been the judgment of the people who had decided she was theirs, concluded that the thing she was doing was the thing that confirmed she was not sufficiently theirs. Letters were written. The press covered the coverage of the letters. The principality expressed itself with the specific efficiency of the small community whose members can express themselves to each other and to the authority they are addressing with the directness that the community's scale allows. And the expression produced the specific pressure on the authority that the community's expression was organized around producing, which was the pressure of the sovereign's subjects on the sovereign to resolve the situation in the direction that the subject's expression was indicating as the required resolution. Rainier resolved it. He told Grace she could not make the film. The telling produced in Grace the specific response that the accounts of the period preserve in the form of the internal experience rather than the external expression, because the external expression of the person whose marriage's image required the management of the private register, required that the response be the managed version rather than the private one. The private version was the response of someone who had been told, 6 years after the contract had required the renunciation of her career, and in the context of the one available opportunity to return to that career, that the director she had worked with 3 times had specifically arranged for her, that the return was not permitted. The managed version was the announcement that the princess had decided, due to scheduling conflicts and the demands of her family and the requirements of her role in Monaco, that she would not be able to accept the offer at this time. The managed version was the version the public received. The private version was the version that the accounts of the people who were in the palace in those months have preserved, and the private version was the version of a woman who had understood with a clarity that the 6 years of the management had been building toward, that the specific quality of the thing that had been removed from her daily life was the thing that the one available opportunity to recover it had now confirmed was permanently unavailable, rather than temporarily so. The banning of her films in Monaco had been the first statement of the condition. The contract's career renunciation had been the second. The Marnie prohibition was the third, and the third was the third in the form of the most direct available statement of the condition, which was the statement of the person whose authority over the condition was the authority of the sovereign, rather than the authority of the contract or the institutional management, because the Marnie prohibition was the prohibition of a man who had looked at his wife's desire to return to the work that had made her who she was, and had said no, in the register of the person whose no was the no that the 20,000 people of his principality and the institutional management of the fairy tale's image had produced as the appropriate resolution of the situation. The no was not without its calculation. Grace had a leverage point in the Monaco France crisis of 1962, the specific political situation in which de Gaulle's France was threatening the annexation of Monaco over the principality's status as a tax haven, and the leverage point was the leverage that an American princess of international prominence provided to a prince whose negotiating position with France was the negotiating position of the sovereign of a 400-acre principality. Grace was useful to Rainier in the crisis, in the specific way that her international profile made the principality's situation visible to the American press and the American diplomatic world, in a way that the principality's own communications capacity could not achieve. and the usefulness was the calculation that the no's timing reflected, because the no arrived in the context of the leverage point's activation rather than in the context of the Hitchcock offer's arrival alone. Whether the calculation was the primary driver of the no or the monegasque hostility was the primary driver is the question that the available accounts do not resolve with the precision that the resolution would require, because the available accounts are the accounts of people whose proximity to the sovereign's internal decision-making process was the proximity of the palace's social world rather than the proximity of the sovereign's own deliberation, and the deliberation was the deliberation that the sovereign had conducted in the private register that this account does not have access to. What the available accounts establish is the outcome, which was the no, and the no's consequences, which were the consequences of the permanent loss of the available opportunity, rather than the consequences of the temporary delay that the managed public version had presented the situation as. Hitchcock eventually made Marnie with Tippi Hedren. The film was released in 1964 and was received with the ambivalence that the critics brought to a Hitchcock film made with an actress who was not the actress who had been announced as the film's star and who had then not made it, because the film carried the specific weight of the absence of the person it had been designed for. Whether Tippi Hedren was a lesser actress than Grace Kelly is not the question that the film's reception required to be asked, because the film's reception was organized around the specific presence of the person who was in the film, rather than the specific absence of the person who was not. But the film that Hitchcock had designed for Grace, and that Grace had been told she could not make, was the film that existed in the absence's place, and the absence was the absence that the no had produced. Grace never appeared in another film. She appeared in a documentary, Rearranged, in 1982, the year of her death, in which she read poetry. The reading was the reading of a woman who had found in the poetry the available form of the performance that the palace's environment had not prohibited, because the poetry reading was not the cinema, and was not the contract's renunciation's target, and was not the monegasque's understanding of what their princess should not be doing. And so the poetry reading was permitted, and Grace read poems for the documentary, and the documentary was the last time a camera recorded her performing the work that the formation had produced her for. The documentary was released after her death. She never saw it in the form that the public eventually received. Caroline Louise Marguerite arrived 9 months and 5 days after the ceremony, and Albert Alexandre Louis Pierre arrived on the 14th of March 1958, 23 months after his sister, and Stephanie Marie Elizabeth arrived on the 1st of February 1965, 9 years after the wedding and 2 years after the Marnie prohibition had confirmed the condition that the marriage had been establishing since the months of the affairs and the hairdresser's salon. The 3 children arrived across 9 years of the marriage in the specific form that the contract had required them to arrive, which was the form of the heirs that the dynastic condition of the marriage of a sovereign prince demanded, and that the contract had specified as one of the conditions of the marriage's permission. They arrived as the institutional requirement. They became something else. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What they became was the dimension of the Monaco years that the accounts of Grace's life have consistently identified as the dimension that Grace herself identified as the dimension that the years had given her that she had not anticipated valuing as she valued it. The acting had been the thing she understood herself as having formed around. The children were the thing the contract had required. The experience of the children, in the palace and in the specific environment of the marriage that the palace contained, was the experience that the biographers and the friends who knew Grace across those years have described in the terms that Grace herself used when she spoke about the children, which were the terms of the genuine rather than the required, the terms of the person who had found the thing and who was reporting the finding rather than the performance of the finding. She brought to the children the formation that the Kelly household had not brought to her, and the bringing was the bringing of the specific person who understands what the absence of the thing has meant, and who therefore values the provision of it in a way that the person who received it naturally does not need to value, because the provision's value is the value of the thing's presence, rather than the value of the thing's presence in the context of its absence. Grace had been the insufficient daughter in the Kelly household, the child whose formation the household's organizing principle had not valued, and the insufficiencies experience had produced in her the understanding of what the specific qualities of the formation she had not received were worth, and the understanding had produced the specific intention to provide those qualities to the children she was now producing as the contract's requirement. The nursery doors were open. Rita Gam, one of Grace's closest American friends from the Hollywood years, who visited Monaco regularly across the marriage's duration, described the specific quality of the children's presence in the daily life of the palace, in the terms that the observation of the visitor who has come from the outside and who sees the inside in the specific way that the visitor sees what the permanent resident has ceased to notice. The children were very much a part of the fabric of the day, Gam told the biographers who assembled the accounts of those years. The nursery doors were open, and the children were incorporated into the household's daily life in the way that the Kelly household's daily life had not incorporated Grace and her siblings, which was the way of the parent who had decided that the children were the household's primary occupation rather than the household's required product. The American informality that the Monegasques had found insufficient in Grace as the princess of the principality was the quality that she had deliberately imported into the children's formation, rather than the quality that she was managing to suppress in the performance of the protocol. The children spoke English at home alongside French. The household's domestic rhythm was organized around the children's presence rather than around the requirement to manage the children's presence away from the official calendar. Rainier cringing at the friends who came to visit, and the loosening up that the friends encouraged, was the Rainier of the official context discomfort with the informality that Grace had organized the domestic context around. And the domestic context's organization around the informality was the organization that Grace had designed in the specific way that a person who has understood what the formal and the managed produces in the people who grow up inside it, designs the environment for the people whose growing up she is now responsible for. The design was the design of someone who understood the Kelly household's specific failure without having been required to articulate the failure in the analytical terms that this account has been applying to it, because the understanding was the understanding of the person who experienced the failure rather than the understanding of the person who examines the failure from outside. And the person who experiences the failure produces from the experience the specific intention to not reproduce the failure in the next generation, rather than the articulation of the failure's dimensions that the analyst produces. Grace had experienced the insufficient daughter formation, and the cold mother formation, and the athletic over-artistic formation, and the experience had produced the specific intention to not reproduce those formations in Caroline and Albert and Stephanie, and the intention was visible in the nursery doors and the American informality and the children as the fabric of the day. The miscarriages were the losses that arrived alongside the children who arrived, and that the accounts of the Monaco years document in the specific way that the biographical record documents the losses of the people whose public life has been managed in the direction of the image rather than the reality, which was the way of the known and the not elaborated, the included and the not detailed. Multiple miscarriages occurred between the 3 children who survived. The number is the number that the accounts have described as multiple without specifying the precise number, because the precision is the precision that the private medical record provides, and the private medical record is the private medical record. What the accounts have established is the pattern of the losses alongside the arrivals and the specific quality of what the losses meant to a woman whose engagement with the children who arrived was the engagement that the nursery's open doors and the fabric of the day established. The losses were the losses in the specific context of the person for whom the children had become the thing that the palace had given that she had not expected to give back to in the way she was giving back to it. And the losses in that context were the losses of the thing that the context had made specific, rather than the losses of the institutional requirement that the contract had specified. The distinction is the distinction between the woman who loses the heir and the woman who loses the child, and Grace was both. And the distinction matters because the institutional record had always been organized around the heir and the person had always been organized around the child, and the losses were the losses of both simultaneously. Jack Kelly died on the 20th of June 1960. He was 70 years old and he died of a stroke in Philadelphia, and his death arrived in Grace's life at the point that the accounts of the Monaco years have identified as the lowest point of the early marriage. The point at which the affairs and the hairdresser's salon and the Monegasque's hostility and the protocols and Madge's reporting and the nursery's open doors and the miscarriages had produced in Grace the specific compound of the managed and the genuine, that the compound of those things in that specific proportions, in that specific environment produces. The father's death added to the compound. The adding was the adding of the dimension of the loss that the accounts of Grace's response to it have described in the terms of the private rather than the public, because the public account of the princess's grief for her father was the account that the palace's management of the coverage required to be produced, and the private account was the account that the friends who were with Grace in the days following the news have preserved in the form of the specific observations of people who were present in the room when the managed version was unavailable. They noted that Grace cried. The noting of the crying was the noting of something that the observers found significant enough to record in the accounts they eventually gave to the biographers, and the significance of the crying was the significance of the private register's expression in the presence of the people who were trusted enough to be present. She had not liked him in the way that the word like is the word for the relationship between a person and the person who has valued them. The Kelly household's assessment of Grace as the least likely to succeed was the assessment of the father who had not valued the formation she had developed, and the not valuing had been the specific injury that the formation had carried into the acts and the affairs and the management of the Monaco marriage. And the father who had not valued her had now died before the accounting of the valuing's revision that the Academy Award and the palace and the 30 million viewers of the wedding of the century might have been expected to produce. He had been proud of her, in the specific way that people who have decided that the things they had not valued have produced the things they recognize as worth valuing are proud, which is the pride that does not revise the original assessment, but acknowledges the outcome that the original assessment had failed to predict. The pride was not the same as the valuing, and Grace had understood the distinction. The understanding of the distinction was the understanding that the grief carried, because the grief for the parent who died before the revision of the original assessment is the grief of the person who understands that the revision is now unavailable, that the thing being sought from the relationship's future is the thing that the relationship's ending has confirmed will not be provided, and that the not providing is now the permanent condition rather than the current one. Grace cried. The friends who were trusted enough to be present noted the crying. The palace's management of the coverage produced the appropriate statement of the princess's grief. The two versions were the versions of the same thing in the two registers that the life inside the palace required everything to be in simultaneously. Stephanie's arrival in 1965, 9 years into the marriage, was the arrival of the youngest in the specific context of the marriage's settled state, which was the settled state of two people who had produced the heirs the contract required, and had found in the produced heirs the thing that neither the contract's requirement nor the institutional transaction had been organized to produce, which was the specific domestic reality that the children's presence generated. The domestic reality was the reality of the fabric of the day, and the nursery's open doors, and the American informality, and the reading, and the homework, and the meals that Grace organized, with the attention that the person who has decided that the organization of those things is the work worth doing, organizes them with. She organized them with the mink-lined raincoat. The raincoat had been the first coat that Grace had purchased with her earnings from the acting career, and she had been wearing it for 30 years at the time of the Norwegian cruise in 1982, the 3-week voyage with the royal family that her friend Joan Dale participated in, and that Joan recorded in the memoir that preserved the raincoat's detail alongside the other details of Grace's private life that the friendship of 25 years had produced in the account of someone who had been in the room. Rainier teased her about looking like a bag lady when she could afford to carry the finest luggage. She wore the coat anyway. The coat was the coat of the person who had been formed in the Kelly household's organization around the frugal and the earned, and who had maintained the formation through the 200-room palace and the dozens of servants and the principality that the marriage had provided. because the formation was the formation of the person rather than the formation of the position, and the person was Grace Kelly, and the position was the Princess of Monaco, and the two were not always the same thing, and the coat was the material evidence that the person was the thing that persisted, when the position's requirements and the position's provisions were the things that the coverage organized itself around. The children were the other material evidence. They were the evidence that the palace had given Grace something that she had valued in a way that the institutional transaction had not designed, and that the contract had not specified, and that the fairy tale had not required. And the something was the specific domestic reality that the nursery's open doors, and the fabric of the day, and the American informality had produced in the 200-room palace of the Principality of Monaco across the years of the management and the affairs, and the Marnie prohibition, and the hairdresser's salon, and Madge's reporting, and the Monegasque's hostility. The children were what the palace gave her. The children were the only thing the palace gave her that she had not anticipated valuing as she valued it. The rest was the management of the gap between what the palace offered and what the person required, and the management produced the compound that the following years, and the poetry reading, and the Norwegian cruise, and the autumn road in 1982 would eventually complete. The controlled woman was the woman that the formation had built, and the controlled woman's control was the control of the person who had learned from the Kelly household, and the Ada, and the Hitchcock collaboration, and the Monaco marriage, that the management of the internal experience was the management that the external requirement demanded, and the demand was the demand of the position, and the public image, and the performance of the fairy tale for the 30 million viewers, and the Monegasques who had decided she was theirs. The control had been the mechanism that had organized the hairdresser's salon as the room where the prevention failed, rather than the room where the failing was the permanent condition, which was to say that the control had been mostly sufficient most of the time, and the mostly sufficient most of the time was the condition of the person whose control is the control that the formation has produced, rather than the control that the choice has produced. And the distinction between the two is the distinction between the control that is available because the formation has made it available, and the control that is available because the person has decided it is available, and the control that is available because the formation has made it available is the control that the formation's failure eventually reveals as the thing it always was, which was the formation's product rather than the person's achievement. The formation's product could be inadequate to the compound. The compound was the compound that the Monaco years had been building since the first months of the marriage, from the affairs and the hairdresser's salon, and the reporting, and the protocols, and the Monegasque's hostility, and the Marnie prohibition, and the miscarriages, and the Jack Kelly death. And the compound was the compound that a person of Grace Kelly's specific formation was producing inside the specific environment of the 200-room palace of the Principality of Monaco under the specific requirements of the fairy tale's management. The inadequacy of the formation's control to the compound was the thing that the available accounts of Grace Kelly's mental health across the Monaco years have documented in the careful vocabulary of the biographical record that has access to the person's private register through the accounts of the people who were trusted enough to be in the room. The vocabulary of the accounts describes the depression in the terms that the people who were in the room with Grace across the years of the Monaco marriage used when they were eventually describing what they had observed to the biographers who were assembling the accounts, and the terms were the terms of the observed rather than the diagnosed, which was the vocabulary available to the people whose proximity to the depression was the proximity of the friend and the staff member rather than the proximity of the clinical professional. The mood swings were one form of the observed. The periods of withdrawal were another. The specific quality of the person who was present in the official occasions with the control intact and who was absent from the unofficial ones with the control's adequacy tested were the observations that the accounts preserved in the terms that the observations required. The withdrawal was the dimension of the depression's expression that the palace environment produced most specifically, because the palace environment was the environment in which the withdrawal from the official requirement was the withdrawal that had the most available form, which was the form of the private apartment and the closed door and the hours that the official calendar had not scheduled. The official calendar of the Princess of Monaco was the calendar that the principality's official functions, and the charity work, and the cultural patronage, and the formal occasions required. And the calendar's requirement was the calendar that filled the hours that the calendar filled, and left the hours that the calendar did not fill, in the condition of the hours that the calendar had not filled. The hours that the calendar had not filled were the hours available for the withdrawal. The withdrawal was not the withdrawal of the person who has decided to withdraw from the official requirement in the form of the announcement that withdraws. It was the withdrawal of the person for whom the official requirement's performance has consumed the control that the performance requires, and who is managing the consumption's residue in the hours that the performance has not claimed, in the form of the apartment and the door, and the hours that the accounts describe as the periods in which the staff who knew grace in the daily reality of the palace, rather than in the official occasions, noted the absence of the quality that the official occasion's presence had maintained. The quality was the quality that the acting training had developed and that the Monaco years had deployed in the service of the performance of the fairy tale, rather than the service of the character that the director's script had provided. And the deployment of the acting training in the service of the fairy tale's performance was the deployment of the mechanism in the direction of the management, rather than the direction of the art. And the management rather than the art was the direction that the formation had always been organized around resisting, because the formation's development in the Ardor and the Hitchcock collaboration had been the development of the mechanism in the direction of the art's expression, rather than the art's management. Grace sought help. The seeking was the seeking of the person who has identified that the compound has exceeded the formation's control's adequacy, and who has decided that the identification requires the action that the identification has identified as the appropriate response, which was the action of consulting the professionals, whose function was the address of the compound, rather than the management of its public expression. She consulted therapists, in the discreet manner that the position and the period and the palace's management of the information about the princess's private life required the consulting to be conducted, which was the discreet manner rather than the acknowledged one, because the acknowledgement was the acknowledgement that the position's management of its image could not accommodate in the specific period and the specific context of the 1960s royal family's relationship to the clinical vocabulary of mental health. The clinical vocabulary of mental health in the 1960s was the vocabulary that carried, in the specific social world of the European royal family and the American Irish Catholic formation that Grace had brought to the European royal family, the specific stigma that the period and the culture attached to the acknowledgement of the clinical condition, and the stigma was the stigma of the inadequacy rather than the stigma of the illness, which was the distinction that the 1960s cultural understanding of the mental health condition produced in the people whose social formation organized the acknowledgement of the condition as the acknowledgement of the insufficiency rather than the acknowledgement of the experience. Grace had been the insufficient daughter of the Kelly household, and the Kelly household's understanding of the sufficient and the insufficient was the understanding that the physical and the achieved and the managed were the currencies of sufficiency, and the clinical condition was the condition that the managed and the achieved were the things that were supposed to prevent. The seeking was discreet. The consulting was conducted through the channels that the discretion required. The palace's management of the information about the consulting was the management that the position required, and the management produced the condition in which the consulting was the known private reality and the unknown public one, and the distinction between the known private reality and the unknown public one was the distinction that the palace's management was organized around maintaining in the direction of the unknown public one. What the staff witnessed that the public did not was the dimension of the depression's expression, that the staff's proximity to the daily reality, rather than the official occasion produced, in the form of the observation that the daily reality makes available to the people who are present in the daily reality. The staff who prepared the princess's apartment in the hours between the official calendar's events and the subsequent events observed the apartment's condition in the hours that the calendar had not filled. The staff who attended the princess at the meals that were not the official dinners observed the quality of the presence at those meals in the terms that the presence at the official dinners had not made available. The staff who were present in the transitional moments between the official and the unofficial observed the specific quality of the person in the transition between the performance and the rest from the performance. The observations that the staff preserved in the accounts they eventually gave to the biographers were the observations of the compound's expression in the spaces between the management's moments, and the compound's expression in those spaces was the expression that the management was organized around, preventing from being the expression in the managed moments. And the preventing was the preventing that the controlled woman's control had been organized around performing, since the Kelly household had first established the requirement of the performance. The requirement had been established in the household. The performance had been developed in the Ada. The direction had been applied by Hitchcock. The deployment had been demanded by Monaco. The compound had been building since the first months of the marriage. The depression was the compound's expression in the spaces where the performance was not required to be the thing that was present. The specific account of Grace's depression that the biographical record has assembled most completely is the account that Gwen Robbins produced in the biography published in 1976, the biography whose access to the people who were in the palace in those years, and whose proximity to Grace herself, produced the most extensive available examination of the private register's content that a biographical account of the period provides. Robbins described the depression in the terms that her sources had provided, which were the terms of the person who struggles and who manages the struggle in the private register, and who performs the management's success in the public register, while the private register's condition is the condition that the public register's performance is organized around managing. The managing produced, as the managing of the compound always produces when the compound has been building for long enough, the specific quality of the person who is simultaneously the best available performance of the managed and the most complete available expression of the unmanaged, and the simultaneity was the simultaneity that the people who knew Grace in the spaces between the official occasions observed, and that the people who knew her only in the official occasions did not observe, and the observation and the non-observation together produced the two pictures of the same person that the two registers had always been producing, and that the accounts of the biographers had been assembling into the gap between the fairy tale and the truth that the servants carried home. What the servants carried home was not the diagnosis. The servants were not diagnosticians, and the accounts they carried were not clinical accounts. They were the accounts of the person observed in the daily reality spaces, and the daily reality spaces were the spaces where the compound's expression was available to the observation that the managed spaces had been preventing. The expression was the expression of the mood swings and the withdrawal and the hours behind the closed door, and the specific quality of the person who must perform the princess for the 30 million viewers, and the monegasques, and the fairy tale's management, and who has, in the spaces between the performances, the specific residue of what the performances consume. The residue was visible to the people who were in the spaces. The people in the spaces were the staff. The staff observed. The staff eventually told. The telling was the telling that the biographers assembled into the account, that this account has been assembling from the accounts that the biographies assembled, and the assembling has produced the picture of the compound that the compound has always required to be assembled rather than summarized, because the compound is the compound of the specific and the accumulated rather than the compound of the single and the dramatic, and the compound's accumulation across the years of the Monaco marriage produced the specific expression that the controlled woman's control was not ultimately adequate to contain. The containment was the management was the performance was the fairy tale. The fairy tale was the 30 million viewers, and the silver Rolls-Royce, and the Cecil Beaton photograph, and the mink-lined raincoat, carried in plastic bags along the deck of the Norwegian cruise ship, and the person who was managing all of it was the person the hairdresser's salon had briefly allowed to not manage it, and the brief not managing was the evidence of the compound that the management was managing, and the compound was the depression and the affairs, and the Marnie prohibition, and the miscarriages, and the Jack Kelly death, and the insufficient daughter formation, and the cold mother formation, and Madge's reporting, and the monegasques' hostility, and the 200 rooms of the principality's primary residence, in which a woman of Grace Kelly's formation was living the life that the transaction had produced. The transaction's production was the life. The life was the management. The management was the controlled woman. The controlled woman was what the compound eventually exceeded, and the exceeding was the depression, and the depression was what the staff observed, and what the biographers eventually assembled, and what this account has been building toward the assembly of, from the first part's examination of the formation that produced the controlled woman, who was eventually inadequate to the compound that the palace produced. In the autumn of 1962, the same autumn in which the world was watching the United States and the Soviet Union arrange the specific configuration of the nuclear standoff that the Cuban Missile Crisis had produced, the Principality of Monaco was managing its own crisis with France. And the crisis was the crisis of the small state, whose relationship to the large state beside it had produced the specific variety of the political conflict that the small state's economic arrangements generate when those arrangements are sufficiently advantageous to the people who use them to constitute, in the large state's assessment, an arrangement that the large state's tax authorities find unacceptable. Monaco's unacceptability to France's tax authorities was the unacceptability of the tax haven, which was the specific economic arrangement that the Principality's history and its relationship to France had produced, and that had been the arrangement since the 19th century in the specific form of the absence of the income tax that France levied on its citizens and that Monaco's residents were not required to pay. The arrangement had been the arrangement for a long time, and for a long time France had been managing the arrangement in the direction of the tolerance that the small neighbor's specific political and economic situation had always generated in the larger neighbor as the appropriate management of the relationship. The tolerance had been the tolerance of the person who has identified that the cost of the intolerance exceeds the cost of the tolerance, and the cost of the intolerance had always been the cost of the diplomatic and political management of the conflict that the intolerance would produce with a principality whose relationship to the international community and to the specifically American dimension of the international community was the relationship that the principality's specific history and its specific present had generated. Charles de Gaulle changed the calculation. De Gaulle had returned to power in France in 1958, and the return had produced the specific reconfiguration of France's relationship to its own international position that de Gaulle's specific political vision required, which was the reconfiguration of France as a major independent power in the international system, rather than as a country whose international position was mediated through the alliance relationships that the post-war settlement had produced. The reconfiguration required the management of the specific anomalies that the international system contained in France's vicinity, and Monaco was one of the specific anomalies, in the specific form of the principality, whose tax arrangements were producing the situation in which French citizens and corporations were using Monaco's residency and registration requirements to reduce the tax obligations that France's own law required them to pay. The crisis arrived in its specific form in the early 1960s, when France began applying the specific pressure on Monaco that the pressure of the large neighbor on the small one takes when the large neighbor has decided that the tolerance's cost has exceeded its previous assessment. The pressure included the specific threat that the French had deployed in the relationship's history before, which was the threat of the annexation, the specific mechanism by which the large neighbor resolves the anomaly of the small one by incorporating it rather than managing it, and the annexation threat was the threat that the 400-acre principality with 20,000 subjects and the casino and the tax haven and the Prince Rainier III could not address through the military or the economic mechanisms that the large state addresses such threats with, because the mechanisms were not available to the principality in the form that the large state possessed them. What was available to the principality was the relationship, and the relationship that Monaco had, that France could not simply override in the form of the annexation, was the relationship that the marriage had produced, with the dimension of the international community that France could not afford to treat with the disregard that the annexation would have required. The marriage had produced a princess who was an American, and the American was the specific dimension of the relationship that de Gaulle's France could not ignore in the specific context of 1962, because de Gaulle's France was the France that was simultaneously managing its relationship with the United States in the complex terms of the NATO alliance, and the specific political tensions that de Gaulle's vision of French independence was producing in that alliance, and the annexation of a principality whose princess was one of the most famous Americans in the world, was the annexation that the diplomatic cost in Washington was not a cost that de Gaulle's calculation had assessed as acceptable. Rainier needed Grace in 1962 in the specific way that the political crisis required the princess rather than the fairy tale's performance of the princess, and the needing was the needing of the politician who has identified that the specific asset in the available inventory is the asset that the specific situation requires, and who has organized the deployment of the asset in the direction of the situation's requirement. The asset was Grace Kelly's American identity and American prominence and American social world, which was the identity and the prominence and the social world that the Kelly household and the Ada and the Hollywood career and the 30 million viewers of the wedding of the century had produced, and that the Monaco marriage had received as the property of the transaction, while the principality's management of what it had received had been organizing itself around the fairy tale rather than the political utility. The political utility was the utility that the 1962 crisis had activated, and the activation was the activation that produced the specific irony of the same year that contained the Marnie prohibition. In the same year that Rainier had told Grace she could not make the film that Hitchcock had designed for her, he needed the person whose career Hitchcock had built to deploy that career's product in the service of the principality's political crisis. The irony was the irony of the institution that has identified an asset, removed the asset's capacity to develop itself further, and then required the asset to deploy the capacity that the removal has prevented from being replenished. And the irony was the irony that the available accounts of 1962 in Monaco preserve in the specific form of the accounts of the people who were in the palace and who observed the deployment. Grace was deployed. The deployment was the deployment of the specific social world that her American identity and prominence made available to her in the context of the American diplomatic presence in the region and the American social world's relationship to the principality's situation. She used her connections with the American diplomatic community. She was present at the occasions where the principality's position required the presence of someone whose American prominence was the prominence that the occasion's management required. She communicated, through the channels that her social world made available, the principality's position to the people in the American dimension of the international community, whose assessment of the principality's situation was the assessment that the French calculation required to include. The dinner at Aristotle Onassis's was the occasion that the available accounts of the 1962 crisis have identified as the occasion on which Grace's political usefulness was simultaneously most visible and most costly to the marriage's management. Onassis was the person who had the largest single commercial interest in Monaco's continuation as the entity it was, through the Société des Bains de Mer interest that the preceding decade's investment had accumulated, and whose social world was the social world of the international wealthy class that crossed the boundaries between the French and the American and the European in the specific way that the international wealthy class's social world crosses those boundaries. He hosted the dinner. The significant people of the crisis's management attended. The French dimension of the attendees included the people whose assessment of Monaco's position was the assessment that the crisis was organized around influencing. Grace spoke her mind at the dinner. The accounts of the occasion have described the specific quality of the speaking in the terms that Rainier's response established, which were the terms of the American who does not understand that people in this world do not simply speak their minds. The French Treasury representative, who was present at the dinner, had been speaking in the terms that de Gaulle's France applied to the question of the colonial arrangements that France was managing in the context of its Algerian situation, and Grace had responded to the speaking in the terms that the Kelly household's formation had produced in someone who had been told since childhood that the management of opinion was the appropriate response to its presence, and who had been managing the expression for long enough that the failure of the management at the dinner table of Onassis produced the expression in the form that the formation's failure of management always produces, which was the direct form. She expressed the view that the French position on the colonial arrangement was the imperialist position, and she expressed it directly in the company of the person whose institutional position in the French government made the directness that the management of the crisis required not to be the form the expression took. Rainier was furious. The accounts of his response, preserved by the people who were present, and who observed the response in the form that the sovereign's fury, at the transgression of the protocol that the political situation required, takes in the presence of the people, whose observing of the fury was the observing of the two people whose relationship had always been the relationship of the managed version and the private one, established the specific quality of the fury as the fury of the politician whose asset has performed, in the direction that the politician's management of the asset had been organized around preventing. The fury and the usefulness were simultaneously present in 1962 in the form that the political crisis produced them in, which was the form of the woman whose American identity and prominence the principality needed, and whose American directness and opinion the principality found simultaneously invaluable and insufferable. The insufferable dimension was the dimension of the marriage's private record that the official management of the crisis had been organized around managing, and the management of the insufferable, alongside the invaluable, was the management of the thing that the transaction had produced in the form of the person rather than the commodity. Because the person brought to the transaction the formation that the transaction had not been designed around, and that the transaction's institutional management had been organized around managing without adequately accounting for the cost of the managing. The crisis was eventually resolved through the diplomatic channels that the diplomatic history of the period records, in the terms of the negotiated settlement between France and Monaco that established the new terms of the relationship, and the resolution included the specific provision that the French nationals resident in Monaco would be subject to French taxation, which was the provision that the French position had been organized around extracting, and that the Monegasque position had been organized around resisting. And the settlement produced the version of the provision that each position's resistance and the other position's pressure had generated in the negotiated form that the negotiation between two parties of unequal power produces when the less powerful has found the specific leverage that makes the capitulation to the more powerful's terms. The thing that the more powerful has decided is not worth the cost of the specific leverage's exercise. Grace was the specific leverage's most significant available element, and the crisis's resolution was the resolution that the leverage had contributed to producing, and the contribution was the contribution that the biography of the transaction's most significant asset makes to the transaction's most significant crisis, which was the contribution of the person whose value the transaction had identified, and whose formation the transaction had not designed, and whose formation's specific qualities were the qualities that the crisis had required, and that the marriage's management had been simultaneously utilizing and suppressing since the first months of the affairs and the hairdresser's salon. The utilizing and the suppressing were the two activities that the marriage's management required of Grace simultaneously, and that the 1962 crisis had made visible in their simultaneous operation for the people who were in the palace, and who observed the deployment and the fury and the usefulness and the insufferability in the same year and at the same occasions. The servants who were in the palace for both. They carried both home. The carrying home of both is the account of the year that this part has been examining, and the year was the year that contained the Marnie prohibition and the Onassis dinner, and the speaking of the mind, and the political deployment, and the fury, and the usefulness, all in the form of the same person, in the same palace, in the same marriage, in the same year. The year after was the year in which the depression's specific expression produced the seeking of the help that the help required, and the year after was the year in which the seeking was the seeking of the person who had managed the 1962 year, and who had understood from the managing that the compound had reached the level at which the management's adequacy required the supplement of the professional, and the supplement was the discreet consulting that the palace's management of the information about the princess's private life was organized around maintaining in the direction of the private. The private direction maintained it, the servants knew it, the biographers eventually assembled it. This account has been examining it. The Princess Grace Foundation was established in 1964, 8 years into the marriage, and 2 years after the Marnie prohibition, and the Onassis dinner, and the political crisis that had required the deployment of the asset that the prohibition had simultaneously been preventing from developing. The foundation's purpose was the support of emerging talent in theatre, dance, and film, and the purpose was the purpose of the person who has understood that the form in which the thing that was taken from her can be given back to the world is the form of the giving rather than the doing. Because the doing was the thing the prohibition had removed, and the giving was the thing that the prohibition had not addressed, because the prohibition was organized around grace doing the work, rather than grace supporting the work. And the support of the work was the available form of the relationship to the work that the palace's management of the princess's professional engagement had decided was the appropriate form. The foundation was the first of the things that Grace made of what she had in the decade that followed the 1962 crisis, and it was the most institutionally significant of those things, in the sense that it created a structure that persisted beyond Grace's life, and that the Princess Grace Foundation USA continues to operate from the offices that Prince Albert II established in Grace's childhood home in Philadelphia after he purchased the property in 2016 for $754,000 and restored it to the condition of the house that Jack Kelly had built in 1928 and that Grace had grown up in before the Ada and Hollywood and Monaco had replaced the formation of the Kelly household with the formations that the subsequent decades had produced. The circle of the foundation's continuation in the house of the formation's origin was the circle that the institutional record of Grace's legacy has produced in the specific form of the return that the foundation's continuation in the childhood home provides. But the foundation was the institutional form. The personal forms were the forms that the accounts of the late years provide in the textures of the daily engagement that the personal forms produce in the person who has found the available expressions of the formation's needs within the constraints of the position's management of what is available. The flower arranging was one of the personal forms. Grace had developed an interest in the arrangement of flowers that the accounts of the people who observed her in the palace across the late years describe in the terms that distinguish the interest from the hobby, which was the distinction of the person who was making something in the medium of the flower arrangement with the same quality of the concentrated attention that the acting had required, and that the medium of the flower arrangement now received in the place of the medium of the acted character. She eventually developed the interest into the exhibition of the pressed flower collages that she showed in Europe and America across the late 1970s, and that the accounts of the people who attended the exhibitions describe in the terms of the genuine, rather than the performed, the work of someone who had found in the medium the thing that the medium was for. The tapestries were another form. The weaving of the tapestry is the work of the person who is making something in the sustained and patient form of the medium that does not produce its result quickly, and the sustained patience of the making is the quality that the work requires from the person doing it, and that the person doing it develops from the work. And Grace's engagement with the tapestry work was the engagement of someone who had found in the sustained patience of the medium the specific quality of absorption that the acting had provided in the form of the sustained attention of the character, and that the other available forms had not provided in the form that the tapestry's sustained patience made available. The poetry was the form that the late years produced in its most significant available expression, and the significance was the significance that the medium's relationship to the performing arts established when Grace organized the reading of poetry into the public performance that the poetry evening events she arranged across the late 1970s and early 1980s made available. She read poetry in the evenings she organized in the palace and in the venues that the organization of the evenings required, and the reading was the reading of someone who was performing again in the medium that the Marnie prohibition and the contract's renunciation had not addressed, because the poetry was not the cinema and the performing of the poetry was not the acting that the prohibition had been organized around preventing. The performance was the performance that the available form allowed, and the available form was the poetry, and the poetry was what was available. The documentary Rearranged was the final recording. It was the film produced in 1982 in which Grace read poetry, and it was the film that was released after her death in September of that year, and that the people who watched it after her death watched in the specific quality of attention that the film of the recently dead receives, which was the attention of people who understood that the film was the last available performance of the person who had performed in the form that the palace's constraints had left available, and who was performing in that form for the last time. The film was the circle that the career had drawn from the Ada and Hitchcock to the palace, and the prohibition, and the poetry reading, and the circles closing in the form of the film of the reading was the closing that the documentary's release, after her death, produced in the specific form of the last available image. The last official portrait was taken in July 1982, 2 months before the accident, and the portrait was the portrait that Rainier and Grace sat for in Monaco, in the specific form of the last official portrait that two people whose marriage has lasted 26 years produce when the occasion and the institution require the portrait's production. The portrait showed two people in the condition of the 26 years, which was the condition that the accounts of the people who knew the marriage across those years describe in the terms of the marriage that had found its working form, rather than the marriage that the fairy tale had designed as the form it would always be in. The working form was the form of two people who had been through the affairs, and the Marnie prohibition, and the political crisis, and the depression, and the miscarriages, and the Monegasque's hostility, and the Kelly household's death, and the children's formations, and who had arrived at the specific condition of the long marriage's settled state, which was not the fairy tale's condition of the continuous romantic passion, but the condition of the two people who have been through the things together, and who have arrived at the arrangement of the continued together that the things have produced. Caroline had been through her own things by 1982, and the things were the things that the palace's management of the eldest daughter's emergence into the public world had been managing alongside the management of the marriage and the fairy tale's performance. Caroline had married Philippe Junot in 1978, when she was 21, and the marriage had been the marriage that the palace had not wanted, and that Grace had not wanted, and that Caroline had insisted upon, and that had lasted 2 years before the divorce in 1980. Junot was 16 years Caroline's senior, a French playboy whose social world was the social world of the international wealthy class's entertainment dimension, and the marriage's combination of the age gap and the social world and the divorce had produced in the palace's management of the fairy tale's image the specific management challenge of the eldest daughter's public conduct. Grace had been managing Caroline's emergence into the public world with the combination of the American informality that the nursery's open doors and the fabric of the day had established as the household's organizing principle, and the institutional requirements of the position that the palace's management of the fairy tale required Caroline to be performing in the public dimension of her life. The combination was the combination of two things that do not combine easily in the specific environment of the Palace of Monaco, and the not combining easily had produced the Junot marriage and the palace's management of the marriage, and the divorce, and the subsequent management of Caroline's public identity in the period between the Junot divorce and the 1983 marriage to Stefano Casiraghi that would produce the children and the happiness that the accounts of the Caroline marriage describe as the happiness that the palace had been hoping the Junot marriage would produce and had not. Stephanie was 17 in 1982, and 17 in the Palace of Monaco, for the youngest daughter of the princess of the fairy tale was 17 in the specific environment of the position's requirements, and the fairy tale's management, and the siblings' preceding establishment of the paths that Stephanie would eventually depart from, rather than follow, because the departing was the direction that Stephanie's formation and the palace's specific environment had produced in the youngest daughter's relationship to the institutional requirements that the eldest two had navigated in the forms that the navigation had taken. Grace was managing all of it in 1982 from the position of the person who had been managing the compound for 26 years and who had found, in the managing, the specific equilibrium of the managed life that the available forms had produced. The equilibrium was not the fairy tale's happiness, it was the equilibrium of the person who has made what she could of what she had, and who has found in the making the available forms that the having's constraints have allowed. The flower collages and the tapestries and the poetry evenings and the foundation and the mink-lined raincoat carried in plastic bags on the deck of the Norwegian cruise ship were the forms that the making had produced. The Norwegian cruise was in late August 1982, 3 weeks before the accident. Joan Dale was there, the friend who had been asked to be the lady-in-waiting replacing Madge 20 years earlier, and whose presence in Grace's life, across the subsequent decades, had produced the memoir that preserved the raincoat's detail and the plastic bags, and Rainier's teasing about the bag lady. Grace wore the coat on the deck. Rainier teased her. She continued wearing it. Joan observed, which was the function of the friend who has been in the room across enough of the years to understand that the observing is the function that the friendship requires in the late years, when the managing has been the managing of the long marriage, and the public position, and the children's formations, and the depression, and the affairs, and the Marnie prohibition, and the Kelly household's insufficient daughter formation. Joan Dale observed. She wrote it down eventually. The mink-lined raincoat and the plastic bags and the Rainier teasing, and the Grace continuing to wear it. These were the details that the friendship's observation produced, in the form that the friendship's memoir eventually preserved, and they were the details of the person who was the person, rather than the position, in the specific form that the 30-year-old raincoat established as the form of the person's persistence through the position's requirements. The raincoat was the coat the actress had bought with her own money. The princess had been wearing it for 30 years. 3 weeks after the Norwegian cruise, on the 13th of September, 1982, Grace drove on the road from Rock Agel, the family's farmhouse above Monaco, toward the principality below. The road was the road she had driven many times. The car was the 1971 Rover P6 that the palace used for private driving. She was 52 years old. Stephanie was in the car with her. What happened on that road is what the next part examines, in the terms that the available evidence provides, and the available evidence has not fully resolved. The road between Rockagel and Monaco is the road that the people who know the principality describe in the terms that the people who know a specific road know it, which are the terms of the specific sections, and the specific turns, and the specific quality of the attention that the specific sections and turns require from the person driving them. The D37 descends from the farmhouse above the principality through the specific terrain of the Maritime Alps' lower slopes, and the descent is the descent of 18 hairpin bends across the specific geography of the hillside that the road has been cut through. And the hairpin bends are the bends that the person who has driven the road many times has driven in the specific form of the person who knows where the bends are before the bends arrive, and who has therefore organized the attention of the driving around the knowledge rather than the discovery. Grace had driven the road many times. The accounts of the family's use of Rock Agel, the farmhouse property that Rainier and Grace had acquired as the private retreat from the palace's institutional requirements, and that had become the family's domestic alternative to the 200-room palace, established the road as the road of regular use, rather than occasional navigation, the road between the private and the official, that the family's movement between the two properties required to be driven with the regularity that the movement produced. She knew the road in the specific way that the person who has driven a road many times knows it, which was the way of the unconscious competence, rather than the conscious attention, the way of the person for whom the road has been internalized into the driving, rather than the driving being organized around the road's management. The 13th of September 1982 was a Monday. The drive from Rock Agel toward Monaco was the drive that the accounts of the day describe as the drive that began in the late morning after the work of the packing that the return from the farmhouse required, and the packing had produced the amount of luggage and the specific organization of the car's loading that the return's logistics required. Stephanie was in the car. She was 17 years old, and the accounts of the drive's beginning describe her and Grace in the car in the terms that the accounts of the beginning of a drive describe the two people who are beginning it, which were the terms of the ordinary rather than the significant, the beginning of the drive between two familiar points in the car that the palace used for the private driving. What happened on the road has been examined by the official investigation and by the subsequent biographical accounts and by the medical analysts who have examined the available evidence with the attention of people whose professional function is the examination of the available evidence, and whose examination has produced, across the decades since the accident, the specific condition of the available understanding that the account must work with, which is the condition of the established and the unresolved coexisting in the same event. What is established is the trajectory of the car on the road between the upper section of the D37 and the point at which the car left the road and descended the hillside and came to rest against the vegetation and the terrain below the road's edge. What is unresolved is what produced the trajectory. The car left the road on a section between two of the hairpin bends that the descent required, at a point that the investigation identified as the section where the road's specific geometry and the specific conditions of the descent produced the trajectory that the car's departure from the road required to explain. The car descended the hillside in the manner that a car descends a hillside when the car has left the road, in the conditions that the investigation established were the conditions of the departure, and the descent ended at the point that the investigation established as the endpoint, and the endpoint was the point at which the car came to rest, in the condition that the investigation found when the investigation's examination of the vehicle and the site produced the findings that the official record contains. Stephanie survived. The accounts of Stephanie's experience of the accident have been the accounts that the biographers assembled from Stephanie's own statements across the years following the accident, and that the statements have preserved in the specific form of the person who was in the car, and who was therefore the closest available witness to the event, whose cause the investigation was organized around establishing. Stephanie's statements have been the statements of someone whose account of what happened in the car in the moments before the road departure has varied in the specific ways that the accounts of trauma survivors vary when the trauma has produced the specific quality of the memory that trauma produces, which is the memory whose details are available in the form of the fragments that the experience of the traumatic event preserves, rather than the continuous narrative that the experience of the ordinary event preserves. The fragments that Stephanie's account preserved have included, across the different statements she made in different contexts across the years, the fragment of Grace saying she could not control the brakes, and the fragment of Grace saying she felt something happening to her, and the fragment of the car's behavior in the moments before the departure, that the fragments describe, in the terms that the physical experience of being in a car that is losing control describes its physical experience to the people who are in it. The fragments were the fragments that the official investigation received, and that the investigation's examination assessed in the context of the physical evidence of the car and the road that the investigation had also assembled, and the assessment produced the conclusions that the official record contains, and that the account of the accident's cause is working with when the account examines the available evidence. The petit mal seizure theory was the theory that the medical analysts who examined the available evidence in the years following the accident identified as the most plausible explanation of the physical evidence in the context of Grace's medical history. A petit mal seizure, in the neurological vocabulary of the small seizure that does not produce the full physical convulsion of the grand mal, but that produces the brief loss of consciousness, or the brief alteration of consciousness, that the petit mal's specific neurological event generates, would have produced in the driver of a car on the hairpin bends of the D37 the specific loss of control that the trajectory of the departure from the road required as its cause. Grace had experienced symptoms in the preceding period that the accounts of her medical history in the final months describe in the terms of the headaches and the specific quality of the neurological symptoms that the brain tumor, that the autopsy, eventually identified as the primary pathological finding, was producing in the period before the accident. The autopsy established a brain tumor. The brain tumor was in the right hemisphere and was at a stage of development that the pathological examination of the tumor's specific characteristics established as the stage whose specific effects on the brain's function in the weeks and months preceding the tumor's identification included the neurological symptoms that the symptoms' presence in the final months was consistent with having been the tumor's production. The tumor's stage and its specific location in the right hemisphere produced in the neurological analysis the conclusion that the tumor's effects on Grace's neurological function in the moments on the D37 were the effects that the petit mal seizure theory required to explain the departure from the road on a section that the driver's familiarity with the road would otherwise have navigated in the way that the driver's familiarity with the road had navigated it in the preceding months of regular use. The investigation's official conclusion was the conclusion of the investigation that was conducted in Monaco in the weeks following the accident, and that produced the findings that the official record contains. The official conclusion was organized around the physical evidence of the car and the road, rather than the neurological analysis of the pathological findings, and the physical evidence's examination produced the conclusion that the accident was the accident of the car, whose brakes had experienced the failure that the car's examination had established and whose trajectory had therefore been the trajectory that the brake failure had produced in the descent of the D-37's hairpin section. The brake failure conclusion was the conclusion that the official investigation produced, and that the palace's management of the investigation's public account was organized around maintaining as the account's primary available explanation. The palace's management of the investigation was the management of the investigation conducted in a principality whose sovereign had the specific institutional relationship to the investigation's process, that the sovereign of a principality whose legal and administrative structures are organized around the sovereign's authority has to the investigation's process, and the management's production of the official conclusion was the production that the available accounts of the investigation's conduct describe in the terms of the investigation that produced the conclusion that the managing parties had decided the investigation should produce. The managing parties were the parties of the principality's official apparatus, and the official apparatus's management of the investigation produced the brake failure conclusion. The brake failure conclusion and the petit mal seizure theory and the brain tumor pathology coexist in the available record as the three available explanations of the same event, and the coexistence is the coexistence of the established and the unresolved that the account must hold without the resolution that the investigation's official conclusion was designed to provide, and that the subsequent medical and neurological analysis has complicated rather than confirmed. The complication is the complication of the evidence that the subsequent analysis has added to the official record in the form of the pathological findings that the official investigation's conclusion had not fully incorporated, and the not fully incorporating was the not fully incorporating of the investigation that produced the conclusion rather than the investigation that examined the evidence in the direction that the evidence required. Grace was alive when the car came to rest. She was taken to the Centre Hospitalier Princess Grace, the hospital that bore her name, and she was treated in the specific context of the person who has sustained the injuries that the accident had produced, and whose condition in the hours following the accident was the condition that the medical staff of the hospital were managing with the resources and the protocols that the management required. She was 52 years old. Stephanie was with her in the initial period at the hospital. Rainier was there. Caroline was there. Albert was reached and came. She died on the 14th of September 1982, one day after the accident, in the hospital that bore her name. The cause of death was established as the injuries sustained in the accident, in the specific form that the medical record of the 24 hours between the accident and the death produced as the record of the medical management of the injuries' progression in the form that the injuries had taken. She was 52 years old. She had been the Princess of Monaco for 26 years and 5 months. She had been Grace Kelly for 26 years and 5 months before that. The palace servants heard the news on the 14th of September. They had been in the palace on the 13th, managing the 200 rooms and the official functions, and the principality's daily operation, in the absence of the prince, who was at the hospital with his wife and his children. They had been in the palace on the 14th, in the specific condition of the institution whose head is absent, in the circumstance that requires the institution to continue operating, while the human event that has removed the head is the human event that the institution's management has not organized itself around addressing in any form other than the continuation of the operation that the institution requires to be continued. They heard the news on the 14th. They had known things across the 26 years that the news on the 14th was now releasing from the private register into the public record in the form of the death that produces the release of what the life had required to be managed. The death was the release. The release was the beginning of the account that the biographers would eventually assemble from what the servants had known and what the friends had observed and what the palace's management had been managing and what the management had produced in the form of the 2 pictures of the same person that the 2 registers had always been producing. This account has been assembling the pictures from the available register. The next part examines what the assembling has produced. The sentence that Grace Kelly said to her hairdresser has now been in the public record for long enough that the sentence has passed from the revelation into the fact, which is the specific passage that sentences of this kind make when the biographical record has incorporated them into the account, and when the account has been in the public domain for long enough that the account is what is known, rather than the revelation that the publication produced. The sentence is, "I know my husband has affairs with other women. That's very frustrating to me and makes me very unhappy." The sentence is in Wendy Lee's True Grace. The sentence is the sentence that the hairdresser carried home from the palace salon, and the carrying home was the carrying home of the thing that the palace's management of the Fairytale's image had been organized around preventing from being carried home, and the prevention had been the prevention of the form of the managed version rather than the actual carrying, because the hairdresser had been in the room and had heard the sentence and had carried it home, regardless of the management's organization around the prevention. The management had been thorough. The accounts assembled across the 12 parts of this account have established what the management was managing, and what the management was managing was the distance between the two pictures of the same person that the two registers had always been producing simultaneously. The first picture was the picture of the fairy tale, the specific image that the MGM costume department and the Cecil Beaton photographs, and the 30 million viewers across 9 countries, and the Cartier engagement ring, and the 100 yards of silk net in the wedding gown, and the Rolls-Royce, and the 200 rooms had been producing since the announcement of the engagement in January 1956. The second picture was the picture that the hairdresser carried home, and the carrying home was the carrying home of the sentence and the other things that the servants had observed and preserved and eventually told. The things that the servants knew, assembled from the parts that have produced the assembly, are the following. They knew about the affairs. They knew about Madge Tivey-Faucon's function as the spy appointed by the sovereign to report his wife's movements, and they knew it with the knowledge of the people who are in the institution, and who understand the functions of the people in the institution from the inside rather than the outside. They knew about Grace's confession to the hairdresser because the hairdresser was among the people in the institution, and the confession was the confession that the institution's social world eventually circulated in the way that things circulate in the institution's social world. They knew about the Marnie prohibition because the prohibition was the palace's announcement reversed, and the reversal was the reversal that the palace's management had produced, and that the people in the palace had observed in the form of the before and the after. They knew about the depression because the depression expressed itself in the spaces between the official occasions, and the spaces between the official occasions were the spaces in which the staff was present. They knew about the political deployment and the fury at the Onassis dinner, and the usefulness and the insufferability and the simultaneous requiring of the American and the suppressing of the American that the 1962 crisis had made visible. They knew about the raincoat. This is the detail that requires its own sentence, because the raincoat is the detail that the management had not considered worth managing, because the management was organized around the large and the public and the fairy tale's production of the image of the magnificent and the gilded and the spectacular, and the raincoat was the small and the private and the 30-year-old mink-lined coat that the person who had bought it with her acting earnings continued to wear on the deck of the Norwegian cruise ship, while Rainier teased her about the plastic bags. The management had not been organized around the raincoat because the raincoat was not the image. The raincoat was the person. The person was what the servants knew and what the fairy tale's image had been covering, and the covering had been thorough in the dimension of the image and insufficient in the dimension of the person, because the person was the person who went into the hairdresser's salon and produced the sentence, and the sentence was the sentence that the management had not been able to manage in the salon, because the salon was the room where the management's prevention had failed. The management's prevention had also failed in the room with Eve Arnold's notebook, where the photographer had written, "I got the distinct feeling that Grace Kelly felt trapped." It wasn't the fairy tale one had expected. The management's prevention had failed in Joan Dale's memoir, where the friend had written, "I am sure there were times in the early years when she felt somewhat like a prisoner in a gilded cage behind the palace walls." The person had also failed the prevention. The person had said, in the interview, that the palace's silken curtain of myth had descended around before the Rainier arrival in Los Angeles in January 1956, had made the saying freely unavailable. Fairy tales tell imaginary stories. Me, I'm a living person. I exist. If the story of my life as a real woman were to be told one day, people would at last discover the real being that I am. She said this before the wedding, before the fairy tale's machinery had fully engaged around the narrative of the fairy tale. She said it with the specific awareness of someone who understood that the fairy tale was going to be the public version and who was distinguishing herself from the fairy tale in the register of the person who does not want the fairy tale to be mistaken for the person. She was 25 years old. She was about to become the Princess of Monaco. She knew what was happening. She was saying so before the silken curtain descended and made the saying freely unavailable. The saying was made freely available again when the management ended. The management ended on the 14th of September 1982. The ending produced the release that the accounts of the biographers have been assembling since the ending, and the assembling has produced the picture of the person that the 26 years of the management had been covering, and that the people who were in the rooms had been carrying home, and that the biographers had eventually assembled from what the rooms had carried. The assembling has produced the following honest account of what the servants knew. That Grace Patricia Kelly was an actress of the first order whose formation had produced the instrument that Hitchcock had identified as the specific instrument for his specific cinema, and whose career at 24 included the Academy Award and 2 more Hitchcock films in development, and the entirety of the most productive decades of the instrument's available use ahead of it. That she surrendered the career for a transaction whose terms included the $2 million dowry she paid half of herself, and the contract's renunciation of the acting, and the ban on her films in Monaco, and the lady-in-waiting who was a spy, and the affairs within months of the ceremony, and the Marnie prohibition 8 years later, and the Onassis dinner fury, and the depression that the compound of all of it produced. That she was managed, across the 26 years of the management, in the direction of the fairy tale's image rather than the honest account of the person, and that the management was thorough, and the image was beautiful, and the fairy tale was the thing that the 30 million viewers received. That she also had the children. The children were the thing that the palace gave her that she had not anticipated valuing as she valued it, and the valuing was the genuine valuing of the person rather than the institutional requirement of the contract. And the nursery doors were open, and the children were the fabric of the day, and the American informality was the informality she had organized the domestic reality around, because the domestic reality was the dimension of the palace that the management had not fully colonized, and that the person had therefore organized in the direction of the person's requirements rather than the positions. The children were Caroline and Albert and Stephanie, and they were the formations that the palace gave her the opportunity to make differently from the formation the Kelly household had made her, and the making differently was the making that the nursery's open doors and Rita Gam's observation had documented. That she also had the poetry evenings and the pressed flower collages, and the tapestries, and the foundation that supported the emerging talent in theatre and dance and film, were the available forms of the relationship to the work that the prohibition had removed, and the available forms were the forms that the management had not organized itself around prohibiting, because the management had been organized around the cinema, and the poetry was not the cinema. The poetry was what was left after the cinema was removed, and the poetry was the thing Grace had made from what she had, after the making of the cinema had been taken from what she had. That she also had the raincoat. The 30-year-old mink-lined coat that she had bought with her own money, and that she wore on the deck of the Norwegian cruise ship in the plastic bag-carrying manner that Rainier teased her about, was the material evidence of the person who had persisted through the position's requirements, in the form of the person who had been before the position's requirements had arrived. The raincoat was the persistence of the person. The persistence was the thing the management had not managed, because the management was organized around the image, and the raincoat was not the image. The raincoat was the person, and the person was the thing that the management was always inadequate to manage, because the person was the thing that continued to produce the sentence in the hairdresser's salon, and the observation in Eve Arnold's notebook, and the words before the silken curtain descended and made the saying freely unavailable. She said it before the silken curtain descended. She was a living person. She existed. The story of her life as a real woman, if it were to be told, would reveal the real being that she was. She asked for it to be told one day. It is being told here, in the parts that have assembled from the available sources, the picture of the person that the management had been covering, because the management is over, and the telling is the form that the person's request requires, now that the management is over. The telling is the accounts of the hairdresser and Eve Arnold, and Joan Dale, and Wendy Lee, and Rita Gam, and the biographers who went into the rooms after the management had ended, and assembled, from what the rooms contained, the picture of the person who had asked for it. The picture is not the fairy tale. The fairy tale is the other picture. The two pictures are of the same person, and the same person was the person who sat in the hairdresser's salon and produced the sentence, and who wore the raincoat on the deck of the ship, and who read the poetry in the evenings the palace's constraints had left available for the reading, and who drove the road she knew on the 13th of September 1982 toward the principality below. The principality below was the principality whose fairy tale she had been for 26 years. The road was the road she knew. The servants knew what they knew. The telling is what the knowing eventually produces when the management is over, and the telling is what remains. Caroline was 25 years old when her mother died, and the 25 was the age of someone who had been the eldest daughter of the fairy tale for 25 years, and who was now the person in the position that the fairy tale's ending produces for the person who has been formed inside the fairy tale, and who is now required to manage the management that the fairy tale's ending requires. The management was the management of the loss, and the position, and the continuation, and the specific quality of the public figure whose formation has been the formation of the public figure from birth, and who has now lost the person who was managing the management of all of it from the position that the marriage had placed Grace in, and that Grace's death had now vacated. The position that Grace's death had vacated was the position that the 26 years of the management had established as the position of the person who organized the domestic reality around the open nursery doors, and the fabric of the day, and the American informality, and the organizing had been the organizing of the specific domestic environment that the children's formation had grown inside, and that the children's adult lives had been produced from. Caroline's adult life had been produced from the specific compound of the Palace formation, and the Grace formation, and the Rainier formation, and the Juno marriage, and the divorce, and the specific quality of the 25 years of being the eldest daughter of the fairy tale in the public world that the fairy tale had produced around the Kelly-Grimaldi marriage. The compound had produced, in the period between the Juno divorce in 1980 and the Casiraghi marriage in 1983, the specific Caroline who was managing her emergence into the settled adult life that the compound required to be managed toward, and the emergence had been the emergence that Grace had been managing alongside the management of the palace, and the poetry, and the raincoat, and the D37 road. The Casiraghi marriage was the marriage that the accounts of Caroline's life describe as the marriage that produced the happiness that the Juno marriage had not produced, and the happiness was the happiness of the person who has found the right person, rather than the person the palace had not wanted, and the court had disapproved, and that Caroline had insisted upon in the manner of the person who had been formed in the Kelly household's American informality, and who had applied the informality to the principality's management of the acceptable marriage candidate. Stefano Casiraghi was Italian, a businessman whose social world was the social world of the wealthy European commercial class, rather than the social world of the French playboy, and the marriage in December 1983 produced in the palace's management of the image of the marriage that the palace had been managing toward, rather than the image of the Juno marriage that the palace had been managing away from. The management was the management of the image that the fairy tale's continuation required, which was the image of the eldest daughter, whose life was the life of the settled, and the happy, and the appropriately partnered, that the fairy tale's continuation in the next generation demanded. The happiness was genuine. The accounts of the Casiraghi marriage that the people who knew Caroline in those years have preserved describe the specific quality of the genuine that the Juno marriage had not been genuine in, and that the Casiraghi marriage was genuine in. And the genuineness was the genuineness of two people who had found each other in the form that the right person finds the right person, which was the form of the specific compatibility rather than the specific attraction that the Juno marriage had been organized around. They had 3 children: Andrea, born in 1984, Charlotte in 1986, Pierre, in 1987, and the children were the children of a marriage whose happiness had produced the specific domestic reality that the nursery doors and the fabric of the day had produced in Grace's management of the palace's domestic environment. Stefano Casiraghi died in October 1990. He was 30 years old. He had been racing powerboats in the offshore racing championship when the boat had capsized, and he had died in the accident that the capsizing had produced, and the dying had produced in Caroline the specific loss of the person whose finding had been the finding that the preceding decade's management of the emergence from the Juno marriage had been organized toward. She was 33 years old. She had 3 children under 7. The mother who had managed the palace's domestic reality had been dead for 8 years. The husband, who had produced the happiness of the right person, had been dead for hours. The loss was the loss that the accounts of Caroline's life in the years following Casiraghi's death describe in the terms that the loss of the specific compound of mother and husband within 8 years produces in the person who has been carrying both losses in the form of the public figure, whose losses are the public figure's losses rather than the private person's, which was the form that required the management of the loss in the 2 registers simultaneously, which was the form that Grace had been managing the compound in the 2 registers simultaneously across the 26 years of the palace's management of the Fairytale. The management of the loss in the 2 registers was the inheritance that Grace had not been able to give Caroline in the form of the instruction, but had given in the form of the formation, which was the formation of the open nursery doors and the fabric of the day, and the American informality that the Kelly household had not provided, and that Grace had been organizing the palace's domestic reality around providing. Albert had been 24 when Grace died, and the 24 was the age of the person who had grown up as the heir to the principality, from the specific position of the son whose birth in 1958 had provided the male heir that the contract had specified as the condition, and that the principality's succession required as the requirement. The heir's formation had been the formation of the heir, which was the formation of the person who grows up with the knowledge that the position they will eventually occupy is the position that has been designated as theirs from birth, and whose formation has been organized around the preparation for the position's eventual occupation. The preparation had been the preparation that the open nursery doors and the fabric of the day had provided in the domestic dimension, and that the principality's institutional requirements had provided in the public dimension. And the combination had produced in Albert the person who assumed the sovereign position at Rainier's death in 2005, and who has managed the principality since, with the combination of the Kelly formation and the Grimaldi formation, that the 26 years of Grace's domestic management had produced in the person who was the fabric of the day's primary male beneficiary. He purchased Grace's Philadelphia childhood home in 2016 for $754,000 and restored it to the condition of the house that Jack Kelly had built in 1928. And the restoring was the restoring of someone who understood that the formation was worth the restoration in the specific form that the childhood home provides, which was the form of the place where the formation happened rather than the formation itself, and the place where the formation happened was the place that Albert had decided was worth the $754,000 of the restoring and the ongoing management of the Princess Grace Foundation USA from the offices the home now provides. Stephanie had been 17 when the accident occurred, and the 17 was the age of the person who had been in the car, and the being in the car was the being that had produced the specific quality of Stephanie's relationship to the loss and to the years that followed the loss, that the accounts of her life in the period between the accident and the present have documented in the terms of the person who survived the thing that the other person in the car did not survive, and who has been managing the survival's specific compound since the September of 1982. The specific compound of the survival was the compound that the accounts of Stephanie's subsequent years have assembled in the form of the public life that the survival produced, which was the public life of the person who became, in the years following the accident, the figure whose distance from the palace's management of the Fairytale's image was the distance that the compound had produced in the person who was managing the survival rather than the management. The pop music career in the mid-1980s was the career of the person who had found in the pop music the available form of the expression that the palace had not organized itself around managing in the way that the palace had organized itself around managing Grace's Marnie and the cinema. The marriages were the marriages of the person who was managing the compound in the specific direction that the compound required to be managed in, which was the direction of the available rather than the approved, and the direction had produced in the public record of the marriages and the relationships the specific record of the person who was managing from the survival rather than from the management. The compound of the three children's adult lives, assembled from the accounts of the years between Grace's death in 1982 and the present, is the compound that the palace's formation and Grace's formation and Rainier's formation had together produced in the people who had been the fabric of the day when the nursery doors were open, and who were now the people managing the positions and the losses and the formations in the specific forms that the compound had produced in them. Caroline managed the losses and found eventually the settlement of the late marriage to Ernst August of Hanover in 1999, whose own complications the palace's management of the Fairytale's next generation had been organizing around. Albert managed the position and the succession and the Philadelphia house and the foundation and the sovereign's specific institutional requirements of the principality, whose tourist brand had been rebuilt around the fairy tale that Grace's 26 years of the management had produced. Stephanie managed the survival and the compound and the distance from the management and the available forms of the expression that the distance from the management had left available. The three children were the thing that the palace had given Grace that she had not anticipated valuing as she valued it, and the three children's adult lives were the evidence of what the valuing had produced in the people who had been the valuing's objects, and the evidence was the evidence of the formation that the open nursery doors and the American informality had made rather than the formation that the Kelly household's insufficient daughter assessment and the cold mother management had made, and the making was the making that Grace had done with what she had, when what she had was the palace, and the position, and the prohibited films, and the hairdresser's salon, and the spy, and the compound, and the 30-year-old raincoat. The making was what she had made. The children were what the making had made. The children were still making, in the forms that the formation had produced in the people it had produced. The things that the formation's continuation in the next generation makes in the people who carry the formation forward into the lives that the formation's forward carrying produces. The lives continue, the management is over. The telling is what the carrying forward eventually produces when the management is over, and the telling is the form the truth takes when the form it was required to take was the fairy tale, and the fairy tale has ended, and the truth remains. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.